How do you mean no more commission?
Well, no one in Scotland can commission an idea. You know, if I went to BBC Scotland and I said, oh, I've got this great idea for a sitcom, I've got this brilliant idea for a drama, you know, there isn't one person in Scotland that can okay it unless it goes through London.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of Full Scottish. What's happening today?
Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
That need, that desire for independence is ever stronger than perhaps it was in 2014. So there's an obligation that we've got to give leadership to that campaign. That's what Nicola Sturgeon, as our First Minister, has been doing.
My feeling about Boris Johnson is he can't be trusted on anything.
That is now and forever will be known as the rape clause.
I'm old enough to remember going into Europe in '73, and I remember how much of a razor's edge that was a battling stone. And I think we made it by 53%, if I remember correctly, for going in. And ever since that time, England particularly has been pretty much schizophrenic, down the middle about whether it felt British or whether it felt European. And that schism, that crack has remained throughout English society ever since.
Scotland means business. Scotland's voice won't be stilled, it won't be silenced, it has to be heard.
The work that's been done by Broadcasting Scotland in giving community activists, yes activists, Scottish activists a platform other than the traditional media outlets.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Before we begin, can I just remind members, as always, to observe the social distancing rules that are in place throughout the building, and particularly when entering and leaving the chamber. So our first item is a statement by the First Minister. The First Minister will take questions following her statement, and members may press their buttons to request a question whenever they wish. First Minister.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government is required by law to review lockdown restrictions at least every 3 weeks. The latest review falls due today, and so I will set out our decisions and the next steps in our careful and cautious exit from lockdown. Firstly, though, I'll give an update on today's COVID statistics and a report on our progress in tackling the virus. Since yesterday, an additional 6 cases of COVID have been confirmed, which takes the total to 18,315. A total of 646 patients are currently in hospital with suspected or confirmed COVID, which is an overall decrease of 121 since yesterday, and that includes a decrease of 16 in the number of confirmed cases. As of last night, 9 people were in intensive care with confirmed or suspected COVID, which is a decrease of 2 on the number reported yesterday. And I'm very pleased to report that in the past 24 hours, no deaths have been registered of patients who had been confirmed as having the virus. The total number of deaths in Scotland under that measurement therefore remains at 2,490. However, we must never lose sight of the fact that every death is a tragedy, and I want to send my condolences to everyone who has lost a loved one to this illness. I also know that statistical trends don't console those who are grieving. However, the statistical trends are clear. In Scotland, COVID has now been suppressed to a low level. Indeed, even in the 3 weeks since I last updated Parliament, there has been significant progress. At that time, we were reporting approximately 20 new cases of COVID a day. The daily average now is around 7. 3 weeks ago, there were more than 540 people in hospital with confirmed COVID. The figure today is 342. And there are now just 3 patients with confirmed COVID in our intensive care units. The number of people dying has also fallen week on week, as is shown in our daily statistics and also in the weekly reports from National Records of Scotland. In addition, our latest modelling suggests that the R number remains below 1. It has been between 0.6 and 0.8 for most of the past month. And the number of people in Scotland with the virus continues to fall. 3 weeks ago, we estimated that around 2,900 people were infectious. Our estimate for last week is that around 1,000 people in Scotland were infectious. That confirms, as I explained yesterday when setting out our decision on air bridges, that prevalence of the virus in Scotland is at this stage several times lower than it is across the UK as a whole. Finally, in determining whether we can move from phase 2 to phase 3 of our exit from lockdown, we have assessed our progress in tackling COVID against the 6 criteria for this stage set out by the World Health Organization, and we have concluded that we meet each of them. However, I need to advise Parliament that the 5th of these criteria, which relates to managing the risk of importing cases from outside Scotland, did give us some pause for thought. The balanced decision we announced yesterday on air bridges was essential for us to conclude at this stage that we are managing that risk in an effective and proportionate manner. However, it is essential that we keep this risk under close review. And to be clear, this must cover the possibility of importation from other parts of the UK as well as from overseas. Presiding Officer, taking all of these various factors into account, I can confirm that it is the judgment of the Government that we can now move from phase 2 to phase 3 of the route map. I can also confirm that we will allow in a limited number of sectors an exception to be made to the requirement for 2-metre physical distancing. However, this will be subject to strict conditions tailored to the circumstances of each sector. And let me stress the term exception. The general rule remains 2 metres. For public transport and the retail sector, this exception will be permissible from tomorrow. However, it is essential that the required mitigations are in place and that appropriate discussions have taken place with trade unions before it becomes operational in any particular setting. Given some of what I will cover later, it's also worth being clear at this point that the retail sector includes personal services such as hairdressing. I also want to remind everyone that face coverings, already mandatory on public transport, will from tomorrow be mandatory in shops as well. There will be some exemptions for young children under 5, people with certain health conditions, and for staff in some circumstances. For the vast majority of us, however, it will be the law that we wear face coverings in shops. Wearing a face covering on a bus, train, or in a shop should, for the foreseeable future, become as automatic as putting on a seatbelt in a car. It should not need to be enforced, but the police can issue fines for anyone not complying. However, I am asking everyone to comply, not from fear of enforcement, but because it is the right thing to do. It helps us protect each other from the virus. And that leads me to a general point that it is important to stress before I outline the further restrictions that we intend to lift. The virus hasn't gone away. It is still out there, and it is just as infectious and just as dangerous as it ever was. Lockdown has suppressed it, but as lockdown eases, there is a very real risk that it will start to spread again. And that is not conjecture. It is already happening in many parts of the world. And with every restriction we lift, the risk increases, especially as we start to permit more indoor activity. So all of us must do everything we can to mitigate it. Wearing face coverings is part of that, but so too are the other measures summarised in our FACTS campaign. Face coverings, avoiding crowded spaces, cleaning hands and surfaces, 2-metre distancing and self-isolation, and booking a test if you have symptoms. I simply cannot stress enough that as we move out of lockdown, these basic measures become much more important, not less. Please follow them to the letter. Presiding Officer, let me now confirm the key steps in phase 3 for which we are now able to set specific dates. You will find more detail on the Scottish Government website later today. As will be obvious from what I am about to say, we intend to take the same staggered approach to phase 3 as we did to phase 2. Not all changes will happen immediately or at the same time. That means we are not bearing all of the risk at once. However, the first changes relating to the ability of different households to meet up together will take effect from tomorrow. The Health Secretary yesterday announced important changes for people who are shielding. For example, from tomorrow, you will no longer be asked to physically distance from people you live with, and you will be able to form an extended household if you live on your own or with children under 18. Today's route map includes a link to the additional changes we hope to make to the shielding advice up to the end of July. The other changes I'm about to announce do not apply to people who are shielding, unfortunately, but do apply to everyone else. Before I set out what these are, let me make a general point. Last week we said that children under 12 no longer had to physically distance when outdoors. From tomorrow, that will apply indoors too. However, for adults and, for the time being, older children, the advice to keep a 2-metre physical distance from people in other households will remain. But the general rules on household gatherings will from tomorrow be as follows. A maximum of 15 people from up to 5 different households can meet together outdoors. The advice is to remain 2 metres distant from people in households other than your own. And from tomorrow, limited indoor gatherings will also be permitted. A maximum of 8 people from up to 3 different households can meet indoors. To be clear, that is the household whose house the gathering is in, and people from up to 2 additional households. As long as physical distancing between different households is maintained, this can include overnight stays. I must stress, though, that this is one of, if not the, highest risk change we have made so far. We know that the risk of transmitting the virus indoors is significantly higher than it is outdoors. So it is essential that we all take the utmost care and strictly follow all of the public health advice. That means keeping 2 metres distant from people in other households, being very careful to clean surfaces after you touch them, and washing your hands regularly, especially when you first enter someone's house. At all times, try to avoid creating bridges that allow the virus to spread from one household to another. We're also advising that between indoors and outdoors activity, adults don't meet with people from any more than 4 different households in any single day. Finally, from tomorrow, we will change the guidance so that people who are part of a non-cohabiting couple, regardless of their living arrangements, no longer need to stay physically distant from each other, indoors or outdoors. The next set of changes will take effect from Monday, 13th of July. From Monday, organised outdoor contact sports and physical activity can resume for children and young people, subject to guidance being followed, and so too can other forms of organised outdoor play. Non-essential shops inside shopping centres can reopen, provided, of course, that they follow all relevant health and safety guidance. That will mean that the vast majority of retail from Monday will be open. There will also, from Monday, be a further resumption of important public services. Community optometry practices will further increase their services, especially for emergency and essential eye care. Dental practices will be able to see registered patients for non-aerosol procedures. And to explain that a bit more, aerosol procedures are those that create a fine mist, for example, through use of a high-speed drill, and we cannot yet allow these. Unfortunately, this means that many forms of dental care will still not be possible. However, procedures such as check-ups and the fitting of dentures and dental braces can resume. And from Monday, a woman can have a designated person accompany her to ante- and postnatal appointments, and in addition to her birth partner, can designate one other person to attend the birth and also make ante- and postnatal ward visits. Further important changes will then come into force from Wednesday next week, that is the 15th of July. From that date, indoor restaurants, cafes and pubs will be able to reopen. However, just as with indoor household meetings, opening up indoor hospitality poses significantly increased risks of transmission. So it is absolutely essential that the guidance on health and safety is followed rigorously by businesses, by staff and by customers. That includes guidance on physical distancing and also taking customer contact details for use, if necessary, by Test and Protect. Like public transport and retail, outdoor and indoor hospitality venues will be granted an exemption from the 2-metre rule from the 15th of July. However, this is dependent on the implementation of all relevant mitigating measures and appropriate discussions taking place with trade unions. Mitigating measures in this sector include, for example, clear information for customers that they are entering a 1-metre zone, revised seating plans and improved ventilation. The tourism sector can also reopen from 15th of July. That means all holiday accommodation, including hotels, can reopen as long as the appropriate guidance is followed. Museums, galleries, other visitor attractions, libraries and cinemas, including drive-ins and other venues screening films, can also reopen on the 15th, although physical distancing and other safety measures will be required. And for many, if not most of these facilities, tickets must be secured in advance. The childcare sector can also fully reopen from next Wednesday, something that I know is important to families across Scotland. I can also confirm that from 15th of July, hairdressers can reopen subject to enhanced hygiene measures being in place, and the finalised guidance for hairdressers will be published this week. And finally, I am pleased that we are able to bring forward 2 changes that we were previously keeping under review for later in Phase 3, but that we now judge can be undertaken safely next week, provided that necessary mitigations are in place. After careful consideration, we have decided that from the 15th of July, places of worship can reopen for communal prayer, congregational services and contemplation. However, numbers will be strictly limited. 2 metres physical distancing will be required, and there will also be a requirement to collect the contact details and time of attendance of those entering a place of worship. And unfortunately, given what we know of transmission risks, singing and chanting will also be restricted. Detailed guidance is currently being finalised in consultation with our faith communities, but I hope that today's announcement will be welcomed by all those for whom faith and worship is important and a source of comfort. Presiding Officer, in addition to that, and indeed linked to that change, we will also ease restrictions on attendance at services and ceremonies for funerals, weddings and civil partnerships. However, numbers will be even more limited than for worship generally, and physical distancing will be required. And I must stress that this change applies only to services. Associated gatherings, such as wakes or receptions, must continue to follow the limits on household gatherings and hospitality. I am acutely aware that the restrictions we have had to place on attendance at funerals in these past few months have been particularly hard to bear, and I am very grateful to everyone who has complied in what I know will have been heartbreaking circumstances. And while the changes which come into effect next week will not allow full-scale gatherings yet, I hope they will allow more people to find solace at a time of grief, as well as allowing more people to celebrate happier occasions such as weddings and civil partnerships. The next set of changes, Presiding Officer, will take effect from the 22nd of July. At that time, personal retail services which have not yet been able to reopen, for example, beauticians and nail salons, will be able to reopen with enhanced hygiene measures in place. Universities and colleges can implement a phased return to on-campus learning as part of a blended model with remote teaching. Motorcycle instruction and theory and hazard tests can also resume from that date, but driving lessons and tests in cars, unfortunately, will have to wait a bit longer. Unfortunately, there are other activities which are included in Phase 3 of the route map that we are not yet able to attach a firm and specific date to. However, while we will keep all of this under review, and as we have done with communal worship, bring dates forward wherever possible, it should be assumed at this stage that these other activities will not restart before the 31st of July. These activities include the reopening of non-essential offices and call centres, the resumption of outdoor live events and the reopening of indoor entertainment venues such as theatres, music venues and bingo halls. They also include the opening of indoor gyms and the resumption of non-professional adult outdoor contact sports. We will continue to work closely with relevant sectors on the reopening as soon as possible of all these activities. For example, we work with the outdoor events sector to review the range of events that could take place, as we recognise a one-size-fits-all approach may not be appropriate. However, I hope it will be appreciated, however difficult I know this is, that a number of these activities present particular challenges. And while I do know it is difficult, it will take a bit more time to work through how these can be safely addressed. I also want to indicate at this stage that our current expectation is that Phase 3 may well last longer than 3 weeks. Given the scale of the changes we are making in Phase 3, it may be wise not to rush that or to go into Phase 4 too quickly, but we will keep that under close review. And let me reiterate that it is our ambition and our intention that schools will return full-time in August. Indeed, this is dependent on the virus continuing to be suppressed to very low levels, and therefore it is one of the reasons we are being so careful and cautious in everything else we do right now. Presiding Officer, there's no doubt that today's statement marks the most significant milestone yet in Scotland's emergence from lockdown, and I hope that the measures we have announced or confirmed today are welcome. All of them, of course, depend on us keeping the virus under control. eliminating it as far as we possibly can now, ahead of the, I'm afraid to say, almost inevitable challenges we will face come winter, remains our objective. And we will not hesitate to reimpose restrictions if we consider it necessary to halt the spread of the virus and save lives. I will, of course, make a further statement to Parliament on the 30th of July, and, of course, between now and then we'll deliver updates through the regular media briefings. However, I want to end by stressing the point I made at the outset, and it is perhaps the most important point of all. This is undoubtedly a time for cautious hope and optimism. There is no doubt that Scotland, through our collective efforts, has made great progress in tackling COVID. We should all savour our first indoor meetings and meals with friends, our first pint in a pub or catch up over coffee. Many of us, I know, are looking forward to our first non-amateur haircut in many months. And there will be other milestones and reunions that we will enjoy over the next few weeks. They have all been hard-earned by each and every one of us. But, Presiding Officer, I have a duty to be crystal clear with the country that this is also a time of real danger. Next week represents the most substantial easing of lockdown so far, and we know that meeting people indoors poses far greater risk than going to a park or to someone's garden. And as I said earlier on, we see signs of resurgence in many countries across the world right now. So we must all be aware of that in everything we do. We must remember that COVID, although currently at very low levels in Scotland, is still out there. And everything we learn about this still new virus, about its infectiousness, its ability to kill, and its potential to do long-term damage to health, should warn us that we mess with it at our peril. And so perhaps more than ever, now is a time for great caution. Remember that life should still not feel entirely normal, and at all times, especially when we are meeting indoors with people in other households, we must be constantly alert to the steps we need to take to deny it the chance to spread. And that's why the most important thing everyone must remember and abide by is facts. Face coverings must be worn in enclosed spaces, public transport, shops, and indeed anywhere else that physical distancing is more difficult. Avoid, literally like the plague, crowded places, indoors or outdoors. Clean your hands regularly and thoroughly, and clean hard surfaces after touching them. 2-metre distancing remains the clear and important advice. And self-isolate and book a test immediately if you have symptoms of COVID. The symptoms to be aware of are a new cough, a fever, or a loss of or change in your sense of taste or smell. You can book a test at nhsinform.scot or by phoning 0800 028 2816. And please act immediately and err on the side of caution. If you have any reason at all to worry that you might have COVID symptoms, get tested straight away. It is only because of our collective action, our love for and solidarity with each other, that we have made so much progress. Now is not the time to drop our guard. So let's all keep doing the right things to keep ourselves safe, to protect others and to save lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's already quite a lot of interest in asking questions. I would encourage all members who wish to do so, though, to press their request to speak buttons. Jackson Carlo.
I thank the First Minister for her early sight of her statement, and I would reiterate the call, as we exit lockdown, for all of us to follow the rules, as commendably, really the vast majority have across Scotland so far. And I particularly welcome hearing that places of worship will soon be reopened, a sign that our communities are coming back to life. Today's statement confirms that businesses and employees across many sectors can now plan to return to work. So let me first ask the First Minister about her decision to put her commitment to expanded free childcare on hold. For many of those employees are parents who've waited nearly 5 years for this policy to be enacted as promised, and this will come as a deep disappointment. And it comes when we need to do all we can to make it as easy as possible for parents to get back into the workplace as we all seek to get Scotland back on its feet. Now, the First Minister said she will review the position in December. That's still 5 months away. And I'm asking whether that review could not take place sooner to give parents returning to work now hope that this promised policy may yet be delivered before the end of the coming school year.
First Minister.
Our commitment to double the provision of state-funded childcare, a commitment that hasn't been made by any other government anywhere else in the UK, is not on hold. It has inevitably had to have a re-evaluated timescale because of the impact of COVID, the interruption to construction work and, of course, the obligation on local authorities who, of course, are in the lead in terms of implementing and delivering this policy, the obligation that they have had to divert resources to tackling and dealing with the pressures of COVID. So we are simply being frank with people about the inevitable and unavoidable consequences of that. As I said yesterday, we will, of course, keep that under review. We will look for all opportunities to accelerate progress. This is a commitment, the flagship, if you like, commitment of this government, and I want to see it delivered as quickly as possible because I know the benefits it will deliver to young people as they go through their school education and the rest of their lives, but also know the financial benefit that it will deliver to families at a time, of course, when that financial benefit will be very necessary and very welcome. So, as I've tried to do throughout this crisis, I've tried to be straight about the challenges we face and set out the reasons why some things that we would like to happen can't happen or can't happen in a particular timescale, and I will continue to keep the public updated in that open and frank way. But we will continue to be committed to delivering that policy, and when we do, I hope Jackson Carlow will be one of the first to welcome it.
Jackson Carlow.
Well, I'll hope from that answer that that does potentially mean that that review date can be brought forward even by a couple of months. Can I turn to some of the detail of the Chancellor's summer statement yesterday? And Scotland will benefit hugely from many of his actions, such as the job retention bonus, the VAT cut for hospitality sector, and the Eat Out to Help Out scheme. However, his decision to cancel stamp duty on home sales up to $500,000 does not benefit Scots because it is devolved. Now, his plans are a welcome step, not just for home buyers, but also for those employed people that we want to see getting back to work. Very often self-employed tradespeople, joiners, plasterers, electricians, who we're hoping that as they come out of lockdown, there is work for them to do. And they often rely upon an active housing market for that work. Will the Scottish Government match this action?
First Minister.
Well, the Finance Secretary will set out the Scottish Government's response to the Chancellor's statement yesterday in this chamber this afternoon, and I will allow her to do that. We welcome, as we did yesterday and I have done throughout this crisis, the interventions that have been made. As far as they go, they are all important and all welcome, and we will continue where there are consequentials from these announcements to deliver the benefits of those consequentials here in Scotland, as we have done throughout on stamp duty, LBTT, as it is in Scotland. Of course, as we make decisions on that, we will take account of the different structure of the housing market in Scotland, and we are also particularly mindful. I read some comment from the IFS this morning about the need to be careful around the impact of this on first-time buyers in particular. So these will all be issues that the Finance Secretary will address later. In terms of the consequentials, and let me say, every single penny is welcome, but the additional cash, particularly around the employment aspects of the Chancellor's announcements yesterday, delivered to the Scottish Government amounts to, and this, I saw this confirmed by the Fraser of Allender Institute this morning, amounts to around £21 million. We will make sure every penny of that benefits people in Scotland, but we want to look to see what more we can do over and above that. We are over the course of this month going to be formulating a response to the report of the Economic Recovery Advisory Group, and of course one of the central recommendations in it was to a job guarantee for younger people. Yesterday's announcement goes part of the way to that, but of course we want to look to see if we can go further in Scotland and deliver something of scale and ambition that can avoid us seeing a legacy from COVID of increasing and substantial youth unemployment.
Jackson Carlow.
Let me ask about the First Minister's decision yesterday to keep Spain off the list of countries exempt from quarantine. As the First Minister knows, the Scottish Tourism Alliance has described the decision as a blow to the aviation sector and the tourism industry. And she will know, because she expressed it yesterday, the disappointment felt by, I understand, some 60% of holidaymakers who would have had plans to visit Spain this summer. Now, the decision extends to all Spanish destinations, including the Canary Islands, which includes Gran Canaria, Lanzarote, Tenerife, and then on to La Gomera, and the Balearic Islands, which includes Mallorca, Menorca and Ibiza, all of which have a very low incidence of COVID, in some cases significantly lower than Scotland. Will she examine whether these popular destinations could be added to her list of quarantine countries now? And I think such a measure would be welcomed by many Scots who do understand the need to balance and the actions she took arising from the incidents in mainland Spain with the risk here just as much as we do.
First Minister.
I was starting to wonder there whether Jackson Carlow was outlining his own summer holiday plans there. I also was particularly interested in what appeared to be a proposition from Jackson Carlow that where there are different prevalence rates within a different country, then different arrangements around travel should apply. And perhaps that is something that Jackson Carlow may want to reflect on in different circumstances in future. Recognising, of course, that right now Scotland has a prevalent rate of this virus that is several times, based on the most recent data we have, 5 times lower than the rest of the UK. I'll be very straight, as I was yesterday, on the decision about Spain. I understand how difficult this is for our aviation sector, our tourism sector, and indeed those who might want to go overseas over this summer, although my advice to people in Scotland, if you want to go on holiday, support the Scottish tourist industry by staying in Scotland to have a holiday if you are able to. But, you know, right now we don't have yet sufficient data broken down to subdivide Spain into different areas. One of the things I said yesterday is we want to work to try to develop that picture so that we may be able to take a more targeted decision in the very near future. But yesterday I had data in front of me that showed that the prevalence rate of this virus in Spain right now is more than 10 times higher than it is in Scotland. Now, Jackson Carlow may want to argue that that should just be ignored and we should cast that aside, but I would point to something that I said in my opening remarks. We have, as we go from one phase of the route map into another, one of the things that we assess ourselves against are the WHO 6 criteria. And one of those, and the one that was most difficult for us to give that assessment on this week, was guarding against the risk of importing infection from other countries. So the decision yesterday was vital to give us that assurance to enable at this stage that move into phase 3. But we will continue to assess that and seek as granular a picture of the situation in different countries as we can. And that's not just about prevalence, because as Jackson Carlow, I'm sure, is aware, there are 2 factors at play here: prevalence and any particular circumstances around outbreaks or approaches in controlling the infection. And there is work ongoing amongst the 4 chief medical officers across the UK right now to allow us to make more targeted assessments on that basis too.
Jackson Carlow.
Well, I think that was a bit disappointing because the prevalence in some of the Spanish islands is significantly less than here in Scotland. And the difference, of course, between Spain and the islands is that there is 1,000 miles of water, which there isn't between Scotland and England, however much the SNP might wish it otherwise. What people will have noticed yesterday was the gap between the negative response from some SNP politicians to the Chancellor's statement, particularly at Westminster, and the positive response from Scotland. On the Kickstart Youth Employment Programme, the SNP said it's a kick in the teeth. From Liz Cameron at the Chambers of Commerce, a practical step in the recovery. On the Hospitality and Tourism VAT cut, the SNP said not enough. From the Scottish Tourism Alliance, a huge catalyst for the tourism economy and a huge relief. On oil and gas, the SNP claimed the Chancellor's statement was a hammer blow and shameful. But from Oil and Gas UK, we welcome this support for companies in the offshore oil and gas industry. What Scotland's now looking for is prompt, radical and ambitious action from this government to support our tourism industry, to keep young people in jobs and to rebuild our country. So when the Finance Secretary sets out her plans later, rather than complaining about what she can't do again, will she set out what she can do and what she must do for Scotland?
First Minister.
The most important thing this government needs to do for our tourism sector, for our economy, for society generally, and frankly for every individual in the country, is to provide the most sustainable basis for the recovery from the COVID crisis. And I know Jackson Carlow will never ever accept that anything this government does is any good at all, but anybody who wants to take a step back from this will see that right now Scotland is being successful in tackling and suppressing this virus, perhaps more than is the case elsewhere in the UK, and we need to continue on the approach that has achieved that so that we build that sustainable basis for recovery. And Jackson Carlow is, I think from a sedentary position, said I should have listened to what he said earlier on. He should have listened to what I said as well, perhaps, which is that I welcomed the Chancellor's announcements yesterday as far as they go. But I reserve the right to point out, as my colleagues have done, that if you compare the totality and the scale of the fiscal stimulus in terms of its proportion of GDP, it does fall short of what many other countries are doing. And I think all of us have a duty to point that out. And we want to make sure that there continues to be a response from the Chancellor, because he holds the borrowing powers, he holds the vast bulk of the financial levers right now, that there is a response to the economic crisis that is commensurate with the scale of the challenge that we face. And here in Scotland, as we have done since day one, we will apply whatever consequentials there are in a way that supports Scotland, the economy and other parts of the country, and we will look to see what more we can do to add to that response. And that's very much the spirit in which the Finance Secretary will set out her statement this afternoon. As a government, whether it's on the health crisis or the economic challenge flowing from that, or the many other aspects that flow from that, this government is absolutely focused on getting the country through this as safely as possible. And I believe the vast majority of people across Scotland support us in that endeavour. And in fact, we would not be making the progress we are making now without not just the support, but the cooperation of everybody across Scotland, for which they all have my grateful thanks.
Question 2, Richard Leonard.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I thank the First Minister for advance sight of her statement, and can I also remind members of my register of interests. Back in June, the Scottish Government announced it was establishing a Rolls-Royce working group to protect jobs under threat at Inshinnan in Renfrewshire. And on the 3rd of June, the First Minister told Parliament she would, I quote, work very closely with trade unions, and spoke of, I quote again, a Team Scotland approach. And I'm sure the First Minister believed what she said at the time, but she was wrong. The Scottish Government's Rolls-Royce working group does not include one single Rolls-Royce trade union representative. So if it was a team that didn't include the players. This is not just about the future of a site. It is about the future of jobs. Jobs at a time when Scotland is on the precipice of a major unemployment crisis. It's about the future of work in Scotland and the future of workers in Scotland. The Rolls-Royce workers are lobbying Parliament today. I spoke to Tam Mitchell, the Unite Union convener, just a few minutes ago. Tam has worked for Rolls-Royce for nearly 35 years. And he asked me to ask you directly this question. We face the loss of 550 jobs and a business closure in a matter of weeks. First Minister, can you now share with the workforce what has been done to secure their jobs?
First Minister.
Can I say, first of all, if there is a concern about the membership of the task force, I will take that away and we will look to address that. There is no interest on the part of the Scottish Government at not having everybody involved in a collective effort to do everything we can to secure jobs, and if it is at all possible, to secure the Rolls-Royce presence in Scotland. In terms of what's been done, I personally spoke to the Chief Executive of Rolls-Royce a few weeks ago. We have established with the company a working group which is looking at a number of things. Firstly, what the Scottish Government can do in the short term to try to protect jobs. And I can't stand here and pretend otherwise than Rolls-Royce globally is facing huge challenges in terms of a fall in demand for what it does, and we cannot magic that away, unfortunately. But we have committed to look at what can be done in the short term. But also, importantly, I think this working group is looking at the medium to long term and whether the Rolls-Royce presence in Scotland can be repurposed into, for example, electric provision in the future and technology, and what we may be able to do together to provide a bridge between the short term and the medium to longer term. That work is ongoing, and of course the task force will have a role to play in feeding into that. We shouldn't be seeing this as a point of tension between us, particularly not Richard Leonard and I. We are absolutely, I hope, on the same side in this. The Scottish Government, as we have done in the past with other major parts of our industry that have been under threat, we will leave no stone unturned, and we will do everything we possibly can to protect jobs, to retain jobs, and if possible to retain as many as we feasibly can. But I don't do anybody any favours, and neither does Richard Leonard, if we underplay the challenges and the particular nature of the challenges in the aviation sector right now. So I hope we will have the ability to work together, and as I said at the outset, if there are genuine concerns that we've not got some things right along the way, particularly when it comes to the membership of a task force, I'm very happy to address that and to address it quickly.
Richard Leonard.
Thank the First Minister for that answer. Tam Mitchell also said to me, he said, I have been told officially by the company that maintenance, repair and overhaul, MRO, is not even on the agenda of these meetings because the First Minister's office was told by Warren East, the CEO of Rolls-Royce, that those jobs are gone. Well, a Scottish Government Rolls-Royce working group to protect jobs at Rolls-Royce should not have written 700 Rolls-Royce jobs off. There's another lobby of Parliament today about jobs, and it's by aviation workers from Scotland's airports, organised by the GMB trade union. Some of them are employed by Menzies Aviation. This is a company continuing to claim 100% business rates relief from the Scottish Government, whilst at the same time attempting to fire and rehire its own workers with their terms and conditions slashed by almost a half. Pamela Ritchie, who is demonstrating outside Parliament today, has worked at Glasgow Airport for 15 years. Pamela works for Swissport. 800 Swissport jobs out of 1,000 in Scotland are at risk. And Pamela told me, everyone understands how difficult the situation is for air travel. But to be losing so many airport jobs without any action from the Scottish Government to help us feels like we are the collateral damage in the coronavirus crisis. First Minister, we cannot continue to see more workers feel like collateral damage during this pandemic. So will you work with the aviation trade unions and not just the airport owners and operators? Will you make 100% business rate reliefs conditional on good employment practices? And will you listen to these workers, meet these workers, before more jobs are lost?
First Minister.
I don't know where Richard Leonard's been this week, but I'm not sure I'm the most popular person in Scotland with the airport owners this week either. This is the nature of the difficult decisions we have to take. Before I come on to aviation, let me round off on Rolls-Royce, because what Richard Leonard quoted at me there from Warren East, who's the Chief Executive that I spoke to a few weeks ago, relates to the fact, as I said in my initial answer, that Rolls-Royce, the demand for the MRO services has plummeted, and that's part of the challenge. Now, we want to try to work to make sure that if there are things that can be done to protect jobs in the short term, we do that. I think there is also an even more important responsibility to try to work with the company to repurpose that facility for the longer term so that we can try to secure that presence, not just in the short term, but for a time to come. And we will continue to look at every option there, but I'm not going to stand here and pretend to anybody that these are easy challenges to overcome, given the global circumstances that are contributing to them. And the similar point has to be made with aviation. There has been, for reasons that we've just been reflecting on, a collapse in demand for international air travel. I hope to see that recover as we come out of the COVID crisis, although obviously we've got climate change responsibilities we need to meet as well. So the recovery part of this is the most important. We will work with all companies to do everything we can to protect jobs, but we cannot snap our fingers and take away the global reasons that these challenges exist. And I will listen to any practical suggestions that anybody wants to make about the things the Scottish Government can and should be doing. And on the issue of business rates relief, of course, there are always difficult decisions to make here. We want to support as many companies through this as we can, but we have been very clear. In fact, Fiona Hislop and the STUC agreed fair work principles at the start of this. We are absolutely clear that any company, not just through this crisis, but generally, that is in receipt of public funding should have fair work practices absolutely embedded in what they do. And we will continue to send that message loudly and clearly to all companies, both during and after the crisis.
Richard Leonard.
Thank you. Let me turn to another aspect of jobs finally, and that's on yesterday's statement by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who announced the UK Government's new Kickstart Jobs scheme. Does the First Minister share my concerns that this will deliver low-paid, part-time employment for just 6 months in a scheme which cuts off everyone over the age of 24 when what we need are jobs for good and a quality jobs guarantee? Last week, the First Minister announced that Sandy Begbie would draw up an implementation plan for the Jobs Guarantee Scheme recommended by the Government's Economic Recovery Advisory Group. So can the First Minister assure us right now that the jobs and training delivered by this scheme will last longer than 6 months? That those on it will be paid the living wage or the union negotiated rate for the job? That they will be offered full-time employment or training? And with unemployment in Scotland now above the UK average, will she roll out such a quality jobs guarantee scheme as a matter of great urgency?
First Minister.
The principles that Richard Leonard outlined there are principles we seek to apply across all of our interventions around skills and youth employment, not just a potential jobs guarantee, but also our interventions through colleges and universities. So, you know, that is important to us, and it always has been and always will be. In terms of the Chancellor's announcement yesterday, I do share some of the concerns that Richard Leonard has expressed. I think the announcement can hopefully play a part in a more comprehensive job guarantee scheme, and that's why the work that we are now doing to respond. And on the point of urgency, we will respond to Benny Higgins' report, which includes the recommendation of a jobs guarantee before the end of this month. But the implementation work, we want to see that jobs guarantee be more comprehensive than what was outlined yesterday. I suppose one of the points that I'm not sure, and maybe I misunderstood him, that I would, of course, we don't want to see unemployment rise for any section of the population, but on the age point that Richard Leonard made there, I do think it's important we have a particular focus on younger people, because the challenge of youth unemployment is likely to be even greater than it is generally, and like I'm sure is the case with Richard Leonard, I remember too well from my own youth the scarring effects of youth unemployment, and we must do everything we can to avoid that. So the point I wasn't sure I agreed with was his criticism of the 24 age point. But again, this is something that I hope, while yes, scrutiny and parliamentary debate has an important role to play, I hope that on these issues there will be lots more that unite myself and Richard Leonard and his colleagues than ever divide us. We are on the same side here. We may have slightly different views sometimes on how we go about it, but we all want to make sure that the generation of young people right now do not pay the long-term price for a crisis that is not of their making.
Alison Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm sure that this Parliament will wish to send its sincerest sympathies to the family and friends of 3-year-old Xander Irvine, whose funeral took place in Edinburgh this morning. The huge number of people who turned out on Morningside Road to pay their respects is testament to the love the community has for Xander and his family. He will never be forgotten. First Minister, yesterday the Minister for Children and Young People tweeted that children aren't yet able to attend blended placements unless essential to support critical childcare. I warmly welcome the First Minister's confirmation in the statement today that the childcare sector can fully reopen from next Wednesday. But can the First Minister confirm that this reopening means that it will be possible to move from one childcare setting to another? The Scottish Childminding Association, its members and parents urgently need clarity in this regard. Thank you.
First Minister.
Can I first of all, Presiding Officer, associate myself completely with Alison Johnson's comments about the tragic death of little Xander Irvine. None of us, I don't think, in this chamber can come close to understanding the heartbreak and devastation that his parents are suffering right now. I saw on social media the pictures of people lining the streets for his funeral this morning, and I just think all of us really struggle to find the words to convey the sense of sympathy we feel for everybody who loved the little boy, and I'm sure the thoughts of everybody across the chamber are with his family today and for a long time to come. On Alison Johnson's substantive point, and it's an important one. We absolutely hear and understand the concerns that have been expressed by the Childminder Association. On the point about blended spaces, we are not immediately changing that rule, but it is one we are reviewing and taking scientific advice as we do so. And I would hope that over the course of the next couple of weeks, we will move to change that rule so that young people, children at childminders are able to go from one setting to another. But I hope Alison Johnson will understand that notwithstanding the very real and understandable views that have been expressed by childminders, we have to do that carefully and on the basis of the best possible evidence. From my memory, I'm looking at him to check if it's correct, the Deputy First Minister will make a statement in Parliament in 2 weeks' time around education, and I'm sure this will be one of the many matters that he updates the Chamber on then.
Alison Johnson.
Thank you. I appreciate the First Minister's comments, but the lack of clarity around childminding is threatening the viability of many businesses and opportunities. First Minister, residents of tenements across Scotland have had a welcome respite from commercial short-term lets operating in their stairs for the past 3 months. And my colleague Andy Whiteman wrote to the First Minister yesterday highlighting testimony from residents sharing their stairs with short-term lets, describing antisocial behaviour, including fighting, spitting in stairwells and receiving threatening messages. Now, today's announcement means that all holiday accommodation will be open next week. So will the First Minister share the scientific advice confirming that it is safe to open up residential buildings where elderly and vulnerable residents are still shielding to unregulated and out-of-control businesses operating in them? Do you really think this is safe, First Minister?
First Minister.
I hope Alison Johnson will accept that I am and the government is taking great care in all of the decisions we are taking. None of them are easy, none of them are straightforward, and you know, if at any stage there is a view that we have not got some of them quite right, we are always willing to listen and to review that. Before I come on to that point more substantively, can I just close off the point about childcare, because this is not about somehow refusing to give clarity. The advice up until now has been that it's not safe. So if Alison Johnson is saying safety should be the key consideration, in childcare right now, the advice up until now has been that it is not safe for children to move to one place to another. So if we're going to change that advice, we need to make sure we are doing it on the basis of the best possible evidence. And that's why it is taking a little bit longer to do it. What Alison Johnson has outlined in terms of Airbnb properties or houses that are let out in shared not in shared accommodations, but accommodation with shared facilities like tenements, that is not acceptable behaviour at any time during this crisis or at any time, and that behaviour has to be and must be tackled by the relevant authorities. Anybody who is using an Airbnb property has to comply with the same rules that I've just set out today and are clearly set out in our guidance as anybody else does. But of course, if there are concerns that are raised about the particular operation of any of the changes that we are announcing today, and if there is concern that these are risking a resurgence of the virus, these are concerns that we will act on. And none of what I've said today, and this is part of the difficulty I know for businesses and people across the country, none of it can be set in stone right now, because all of it depends on our continued assurance that we are driving this virus to the lowest levels possible.
Thank you. Willie Rennie.
For weeks I've been making a positive, constructive case for a joined-up approach on childcare. Thousands of parents are being asked to go back to work without the childcare arrangements in place. So I am relieved that finally we may have something that might work. If physical distancing for under 12s indoors has gone and childcare is fully reopening next Wednesday, this may allow parents to get back to work. But the childminding advice needs to keep pace with the education advice as well, because the risk to the childminding sector is clear. More than 80% of childminders feared for their future. This is very serious. So I hope the First Minister will respond to that. The First Minister knows that I'm an advocate for good early learning in childcare, and that I support the expansion to 1,140 hours. I understood that because of the construction industry had shut, that many of the nurseries could not be built or refurbished in time for the expansion in August. I understood that. But I was surprised to learn that nursery expansion has therefore been delayed for a year. Why does a 3-month lockdown result in a 12-month delay for parents, carers and children right across the country?
First Minister.
Let me address the first point about childminders, and I've addressed that substantively to Alison Johnson, so I won't repeat everything I've said. I don't want any childminder fearing for the future of the business. I don't want any business fearing for the future where we can do something to avoid that. But equally, I don't want parents fearing for the health and safety of their children. And therefore, it is really important that as we take these decisions, we take them on the basis of the best possible evidence. That's why some of these decisions have taken longer than any of us would have liked. That is unavoidable. And this one, we are looking carefully at that, but we must make sure we are taking decisions that has the safety of children absolutely central to everything we do. And I'm sure Willie Rennie would agree with that. On the issue of the childcare expansion, I've again already addressed this earlier. This is not a uniform position. Some local authorities will be delivering this commitment very quickly or more quickly than others and much more close to the original timescale. Beyond that, we will take every opportunity to accelerate this where we can. We cannot magic away the inevitable impact that COVID has had on these timescales, but nobody, certainly nobody in government, is keener than I and the Deputy First Minister to see this commitment delivered and to see it delivered as quickly as possible. And we will work with local authorities to make sure that that can happen.
Willie Rennie.
But families are banking on the expansion to enable to get them back to work. Children have already missed out on education and nursery because of the lockdown for months. So the inequality gap continues to grow. And the price of delaying the rollout will be paid in lost opportunities by families and children right across the country. The First Minister says she wants to support an economic recovery. I have to say, there is no way to a strong recovery that does not include strong and growing childcare provision. Her Minister said this week that they signed off a statement that there would be no review until December. And after that, for 6 months, it would not change. A few minutes ago, the First Minister said that this was not fixed. So I want some clarity here. If it's not fixed, has the December review date gone? And has the 6 months notice gone as well?
I'm afraid Willie Rennie has been very constructive throughout this. I don't want to turn this into in any way a sort of adversarial exchange, so please accept that. But what I would say is the reality for almost every aspect of life right now is that nothing is fixed, and that's really difficult. We're trying to give people, so in terms of the timescales that you talked about there, what we're trying to do, given that we have inevitably and unavoidably lost time over the COVID crisis in the delivery of this, we're trying not to raise expectations of parents right now before we know we can deliver on them. So probably this will happen in a range of different ways. We build a bit more time into things that we genuinely hope might be necessary. And that's just trying to strike a balance. But we will be doing everything here as well as doing everything across a whole range of other responsibilities to accelerate things as much as possible. But the uncertainties around this, both in terms of how plans can be recast and accelerated as quickly as possible, but also the uncertainties of what we are facing with the virus are significant. Now, our key challenge over these next few weeks is not to allow this easing of lockdown to lead to a resurgence, because that sets everything back even more. But then we go into a winter period where the risks of a genuine second wave of this are significant. So I would love nothing more, believe me on this, I would love nothing more than to give people in every sector right now cast iron certainty about the future, given the uncertainty of the past 4 months. But it would be irresponsible of me to do that. So we tried to build the most realistic timescale that we can, on the basis that where it proves possible, we will bring that forward if it's at all possible. And that will be the case with childcare, as it is the case for everything else that we're dealing with too.
Thank you. There's a large number of members who wish to ask questions. I would just urge everyone to be succinct. Annabel Ewing to be followed by Liam Kerr. Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. On the important issue of face coverings, with reports from the World Health Organization that the virus may in fact remain in the air for longer than previously thought, would the First Minister encourage people to wear face coverings in any location where they feel unsafe, as well, of course, as on public transport and in shops?
First Minister.
Yes, I would. And just briefly, actually, on the statement made by the WHO, I think 2 nights ago, which is not a definitive statement yet. It was in response to an opinion from a large number of scientists. But the statement that they are looking further into the issue of possible airborne transmission is of serious and significant concern. And I hope this isn't the case, but if at any stage the view of the WHO is that this virus can be transmitted through the air, and what that means is droplets. Our current understanding is that if somebody sneezes, then somebody can get infected immediately if they're not far enough away, or the droplets can rest on a surface, and if somebody touches it, they can get affected. If it turns out that this could be airborne, what that means is if somebody sneezes, the droplets can stay in the air for quite some time, and then somebody coming into the same room, perhaps a couple of hours later, would still be at risk. Now, that would pose significant challenges for us in how we manage this. So just to put it on Parliament's radar, that this is something that is now under active consideration by the scientific community. But it does underline, and Annabel Ewing is right, it underlines the importance of wearing face coverings in enclosed spaces. And I would reiterate the point about this being law as of tomorrow in shops, as it already is in public transport. But don't do it just because it's the law and just because it can be enforced and you can be fined by the police if you don't do it. Do it because it's the right thing to do. If you wear a face covering in an enclosed space, and that should be any enclosed space where you feel a bit uncomfortable or where physical distancing is difficult, then it protects other people from you passing the virus to them, and other people wearing one protects you. So please wear face coverings in enclosed spaces, because it is collectively helping us to protect everybody.
Liam Kerr, to be followed by Monica Lennon.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. On Monday, the First Minister confirmed that not a single follow-up check had been conducted on international arrivals coming into Scotland. 2 weeks ago, her Justice Secretary told the Health and Sport Committee that quarantine checks had taken place on approximately 20% of travellers. Instead of taking responsibility and apologising, he's blamed his officials and even Police Scotland for these inaccurate statements. Will the First Minister promise today to publish in full the advice the Justice Secretary was given from both his officials and Police Scotland, so we can establish precisely the truth of this matter?
First Minister.
Well, the matter is as set out by the Justice Secretary. What he said was what he believed was going to be the case, that the checks were starting on that day, or in fact had started the day before. We now know, and I've narrated this publicly on more than one occasion in the last few days, that it took longer than we had thought it would take to agree the Memorandum of Understanding with the Home Office that allows those checks to be carried out. And Hamza Yousaf has set that out. Also, at the time he spoke to the committee, at that point there had been no referrals to the police for non-compliance with these regulations. But, you know, more importantly, the member may be interested to know that as at 10:15 today, 94 of these checks had been made since they started earlier this week. 72 are in progress. The case reports indicate that contacts are aware that they should self-isolate and that there's high compliance with that. So I know the Conservatives don't like good news on these matters, but there's some good news for them to enjoy today. And again, I come back, Presiding Officer, to a central point here. If the Conservatives' proposition here is that everything the Scottish Government is doing is somehow not good enough, then the question they have to answer is how is it that prevalence of this virus in Scotland is 5 times lower than it is in England?
Monica Lennon, to be followed by Bruce Crawford. Monica Lennon.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. An investigation by the Courier has today revealed that senior health officials regularly raised concerns about PPE stocks before coronavirus hit Scotland. We still don't have firm dates for the full remobilisation of all NHS services, and concerns are growing about non-COVID health risks, including excess cancer deaths and a mental health time bomb. Can the First Minister advise whether PPE stock levels are a barrier to restarting NHS services? Will we have enough PPE to cope with winter pressures and a possible second wave? And can she advise when face-to-face mental health services will return?
First Minister.
The Health Secretary will keep the Chamber updated on the remobilisation of the NHS and the resumption of routine health appointments. But on the direct question, no, lack of PPE is not a reason for not resuming services. And I would remind Monica Lennon and indeed the whole Chamber that at no point during this crisis has Scotland run out of any aspect of PPE. We have worked hard to make sure the supplies are there. We've worked hard overcoming challenges that we have faced along the way. We readily acknowledge that, to make sure the distribution is getting to where it's needed, and where we've had to make changes to that, we have made those changes. Along the way, that has also involved the revalidation of some items of PPE that had been date expired, and we've done all of that and made sure that the staff working in our NHS have the PPE they need, and we will continue to take that responsibility very seriously.
Bruce Crawford, to be followed by Jamie Halker-Johnson.
Thank you, President Officer. First Minister, you may be aware that last weekend more than 20 people were charged with irresponsible camping and environmental damage in the areas of Lochern, Venacher and Ard, all in my constituency. Not only was there large-scale littering, with tents, sleeping bag and camping seats discarded, but fire damage was also caused to trees. First Minister, do you agree with me that while individuals may have wanted to let off a bit of steam following the easing of lockdown, such behaviour at any time is totally unacceptable and will not be tolerated? And if the individuals involved are found guilty, then the full weight of the law should come down on them.
First Minister.
Yeah, I agree with that. The behaviour that Bruce Crawford has outlined there is not acceptable at any time, and it should be dealt with seriously where it does happen. But I would make the point that at this particular time, behaviour like that, or any of us that are behaving in a way that is not in compliance with the normal rules and laws or with the public health guidance that is in place right now, we are potentially, and I'm not exaggerating here, we are potentially putting other people's lives at risk. And all of us have a duty, an individual duty and responsibility, to make sure that we're not doing that, to make sure that we are thinking very carefully about how we're behaving and the application of public health measures. And if every single one of us does that, then we continue to reduce and to minimise the risk of this virus spreading out of control again, because that risk is very, very real. And I can't emphasise this enough. Anybody who doubts that need only look at large numbers of states in America right now. They need only look at Melbourne. They need only look at parts of Spain. They need only look at Serbia, Belgrade in particular. Growing parts of the world are having resurgences of this virus. It's not a second wave. That danger is there for us in the winter. This is because behaviour is meaning that as lockdown eases, the virus is finding it too easy to spread. And we must all be conscious of that in every decision we make right now.
Jamie Halker-Johnson, to be followed by Neil Bibby.
We know that over 4,000 people in Scotland have lost their lives to COVID-19. And we know that there have been 2,000 lost in our care homes alone. What we don't know is how many Scots have had the virus. So can the First Minister advise me what programme of antibody testing is being undertaken in our care homes and amongst the general population? And given we are now more than 3 months into this crisis, if there isn't a programme, what plans are there to introduce one?
First Minister.
We are doing antibody testing for surveillance purposes right now, and the advice that we have is that that is the useful way right now of using antibody testing. That while the tests have become more reliable, the use of those in the wider population to tell individuals whether they've had the virus, and crucially to tell them whether they have immunity to COVID, that we don't yet have the reliability for that to be a reasonable thing to do. And in fact, there was a letter written last week or the week before by a significant number of clinicians supporting the approach that I've just outlined, which is the one we're taking in Scotland. We've got to be really careful about this, because even if we get to the point, and I think from my layperson's understanding, we are getting closer to the point where a test can tell you as an individual if you've got antibodies from COVID, we don't yet understand what that means. We don't understand whether that gives you immunity for a week, for a month, for a year, for 5 years, or at all. So we've got to be very careful about raising the public's expectations of what antibody testing in that individual way can do. But we are using antibody testing for surveillance, and we will continue to extend that programme as the science tells us it is useful and effective to do.
Neil Bibby, to be followed by Shona Robertson.
The First Minister has announced air bridges, but thousands of airport workers are facing losing their jobs. 2 weeks ago, following my last question to the First Minister, I wrote to her asking for her to urgently meet with the airport unions GMB and Unite. I've still not received a reply. Menzies Aviation are putting Scotland to shame by their practices. Swissport workers are so dismayed they've came outside Parliament to demand action. First Minister, the Renfrewshire and West of Scotland economy simply cannot sustain airport job losses and Rolls-Royce job losses on the scale we are seeing. We were one of the worst hit areas by the virus, and many constituents are asking, why do we have to pay the economic price too? There are global challenges, of course, but right now there is no task force for Scotland's airports. There is no plan for Scotland's airports. First Minister, you've said you're open to suggestions. Will you therefore, at the very least, personally meet the airport union representatives to hear theirs?
First Minister.
I think if this hasn't been conveyed yet, I'm sure it's about to be. I think Jamie Hepburn is planning to meet the unions. I'm willing to meet unions. I meet all sorts of people, and we'll happily do that. But of course, I have a team of ministers because there's a lot of work the government has to do, and we want to be able to do all of it. On the issue, I understand acutely the severity of the challenges facing the aviation sector. I think, to be frank with Neil Bibby, simply referring to global conditions as if it's some kind of incidental matter doesn't do justice to the issue. One of the reasons why yesterday's decision on air bridges maybe doesn't sound as if it would have been, but it's one of the most difficult decisions the government's had to take in all of this so far, because public health tells us that the risk of importing this virus now is possibly the biggest health risk we face, and yet we understand the importance for the aviation sector of allowing international travel to start to resume, and therefore we had to make that balanced decision, and getting people able to travel again is one of the most important things we can do to help companies like Swissport and Menzies and airports and airlines. So these are not easy challenges, but we will continue to try to do everything we can, and we will work with trade unions and others to deal with some of the longer term implications of this. Anybody in my position in any country in the world who stands up and blithely says that we can wave a magic wand and take these challenges away is not doing justice to the issue. But we will, just as we have worked day and night for the last 3 months to tackle the virus, we will work day and night to do everything we can to mitigate and deal with the economic impact of it as well.
Shona Robertson, to be followed by Graham Simpson.
As the First Minister said earlier, the Chancellor's announcement of a Kickstarter job creation scheme is a welcome start. However, given the disproportionate longer-term impact of COVID that's going to have on young people in particular, would the First Minister agree that young people across Scotland deserve and need more certainty than a 6-month programme?
First Minister.
Yes, I do agree with that, and while I would repeat this, as Shona Robertson has there, my welcome for the Chancellor's announcement yesterday, we are looking right now in Scotland to see what we can do to build upon that, to give greater certainty and perhaps to give a longer term commitment to young people, because as I've said before, including in response to Richard Leonard earlier on, all of the economic aspects of this are important and have to be addressed, but there's probably none more important than trying to avoid the scattering effect of a significant rise in youth unemployment, and we're very focused on trying to make sure that we deliver an intervention that is capable of avoiding that.
Graham Simpson, to be followed by Polly McNeill.
Thank you. Driving lessons and tests in cars restarted in England on July the 4th. The First Minister said earlier that in Scotland we'll have to wait longer. But she didn't say why. Can she explain why that is and tell us what needs to happen in order to get things restarted?
First Minister.
This is a virus that spreads between people in close proximity to each other, and people in different households in a car. I would have, with respect, thought that might have been obvious. Now, I don't underestimate the importance of this. The members asked me why it's happening in England and it's not happening here. Let me turn that question around. Why is the prevalence of the virus 5 times lower in Scotland than it is in England? It is for the UK government to take the decisions they take. I have been at pains all along to say that I will not criticise them for the decisions they are taking, but I will not simply follow those decisions if I don't think they are right for the objective we have set of driving this virus to the lowest possible levels. So if we're going a bit slower on some things, it is because we think the risk of going faster is too great and will compromise what we are trying to do. And, I've said this a couple of times, but I want to say it again, just to be absolutely blunt with people. If we don't get this virus to the lowest possible levels now, then the situation we will face in winter, which for all countries may be significant regardless of what we do right now, but if we don't get it to the lowest possible levels right now, that challenge will be even more difficult to address and to hopefully overcome. So we'll do things, and we will continue to do things at a pace that is consistent with trying to eliminate this virus. And other governments are perfectly entitled to take different decisions, but I would rather be standing up here today announcing, thankfully, nobody dying yesterday from this virus than if things were proportionate to England's position yesterday, being announcing that more than 10 people had died from this virus. So I'll continue to take decisions that I think are right for Scotland and protect the maximum number of lives.
Pauline McNeill to be followed by Sandra White. Pauline McNeill.
Thank you. According to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, for those who rent their homes in the private rented sector, almost 45% have seen a drop in their incomes, and that is since March. But almost 60% have had to borrow or use up savings to pay rent. And it's the highest proportion of any housing tenure. And those are people who are already in arrears with other bills. Last week, the Local Government Committee said they didn't have enough time to take my fair rents bill through the parliamentary process. And I feel that this legislation is never needed more than ever. And I hope the First Minister will at least accept that rent pressure zones have been a failure and we need something else. In view of that, will the First Minister consider adopting my bill and give stronger protection to renters? I accept that she can't give me an answer today, but at least if she could tell me that she would have a discussion with the Housing Minister, and if not, what action is the Scottish Government going to take to prevent renters in the private rented sector from high rents at this important time?
First Minister.
It's an important issue and one I'm acutely aware of generally across Scotland, but particularly given the nature of my own constituency, I know how important it is. We have taken over the last few years a number of measures to try to protect better those in the private rented sector, and we will continue to look at what more we can do. We've also, during this crisis, of course, increased the Scottish Welfare Fund and other sources of support for people who have financial difficulties, and I think that's important as well. Look, the Local Government Committee took a decision. I'm not obviously can't interfere with the decision that the committee took. I will consider any reasonable suggestion that's made. I'll ask the Housing Minister to have a conversation with Pauline McNeill about whether anything around that is possible. I have to be frank, parliamentary time between now and the dissolution of Parliament is very, very limited, and there are some particular pieces of legislation, not least the incorporation of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child into domestic law, that we want to prioritise before the end of this session. But we will look at what's possible, and if something is possible, we will certainly give that serious consideration.
Sandra White, to be followed by Mark MacDonald.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Can I thank the First Minister for his statement, in particular the mention of music venues. I also welcome earlier commitment of £10 million and a further commitment of £90 million to the arts, cultures and creative industries. However, music venues, which there are many in my constituency, will be one of the last to reopen. Can the First Minister therefore confirm that support will be made available for these venues?
First Minister.
Yes, it is undoubtedly the case that further support will be needed for music venues because the impact of the pandemic has been devastating on not just venues but the music industry more widely. Of course, people in the sector have benefited from some of the funding packages announced at the outset, such as the Pivotal Enterprise Resilience Fund, the Creative Tourism and Hospitality Enterprise Hardship Fund and Creative Scotland's Bridging Bursaries. But we want to do more and we're already in close contact with representatives of the industry to understand their specific needs in order that we can tailor further financial support. But there is no doubt further financial support will be necessary.
Mark MacDonald, to be followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The lifting of restrictions is welcome because it demonstrates the progress that's being made, in particular around households being able to meet indoors. However, for individuals who have family members in care homes, there remain challenges and difficulties, and those are understandable. But I have a constituent whose mother is in a care home nearing end of life, unable to meet outdoors, which is the current situation in care homes, and who can only have one family member visiting when there are other members of the family, siblings, who would like to see her as she approaches end of life. Given the restrictions around face coverings, etc., will the First Minister give consideration to what flexibility care homes might be able to offer to families in the position that my constituent's family find themselves in?
First Minister.
The situation around visiting in care homes is a really difficult one, and the relaxation that the Health Secretary announced last week is important, but I know we want it as soon as it is safe to do so, to go further than that. What I would say to Mark MacDonald is there has all along been flexibility around end-of-life visiting, and if he wants to pass the details to the Health Secretary, we can see why that has not been accommodated in his constituent's case and how it can be accommodated in future. But end-of-life visits have always been recognised as being necessary and something that flexibility has always been available on.
Kenneth Gibson, to be followed by Jamie Green.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, last weekend pubs reopened in England, bizarrely from 6 a.m. Within 24 hours, at least 3 establishments were forced to close again due to customers testing positive for coronavirus. England's Police Federation Chair John Apter said what was crystal clear is that drunk people won't socially distance, adding that officers in some areas had been assaulted. Whilst most pubs will no doubt reopen safely and responsibly, how closely will it be monitored to ensure we see no repeat of scenes witnessed down south?
First Minister.
As I said a moment ago, it's for each of the governments across the UK to take decisions that they think are right. But in terms of our opening of hospitality, outdoor earlier this week and indoor next week, we've chosen to do that during the week, Monday this week and Wednesday next week. So I think that's one thing that you can do to try to make sure that the transition into that is as safe as possible. I would urge everybody to behave responsibly. I think many people will be looking forward to going to a pub for the first time in a long time. But behave responsibly, because particularly if you're doing that indoors, then you are both taking and posing a greater risk than we have been taking over almost 4 months now. So you must comply with all of the measures that staff will be asking you to comply with, and remember to take care with your own personal hygiene and other measures as well. And of course the police, as the police always do around hospitality, will take enforcement action where necessary and will police our pubs and clubs in a way, or pubs rather, in a way that is appropriate, and they will do that. They do that every time, but it is particularly important, I think, over this period that they do that in the sensitive and appropriate way that they always do.
Jamie Green, to be followed by Neil Findlay.
Thank you. It's over 2 weeks since the Deputy First Minister announced that schools should plan to reopen fully on August the 11th. But we already know that at least one local council will not be opening its doors fully on that date. So let me ask the First Minister, why has no further detailed guidance been issued since that announcement on how schools could open safely and fully? How many more councils might not also be opening their doors fully on August the 11th? But more importantly, what advice does she have for parents who had planned to return to work that day, but who now cannot?
First Minister.
Well, the answer to the question, why is there not detailed guidance yet? Because we are working, the Deputy First Minister through the Education Recovery Group will be working on that guidance, making sure that we are taking account of all relevant scientific advice. It's really important that we do that in that very careful and considered way. Some local authorities may well decide to have a situation where younger people have a softer start into full-time education because they've been away from schools for 4 months, but the absolute intention is that schools will open full-time from August. And the final point I would make on this, which is probably the most important one, is that that is dependent on continuing to suppress the virus. And the thing that would put that most at risk is if I was to give in to some of the requests I get, not exclusively, but mainly from the Conservative benches, to speed up the exit from lockdown. That would jeopardise our suppression of the virus and actually do more than anything else to compromise our chances of getting education back full-time. So if anybody out there is feeling frustrated at the pace of exit from lockdown, remember that that's the prize we're aiming for, getting our children back to full-time education in August. So let's stick with it.
Neil Findlay, to be followed by Willie Coffey.
One group of patients desperate to know what the reopening of the full NHS services mean for their health and well-being as Scottish mesh survivors. Yesterday's very good report by Baroness Cumberledge should have made very uncomfortable reading for surgeons, the medical profession, regulators, government ministers, manufacturers and the medical establishment who have collectively failed women across Scotland, the UK and indeed the world. Excuse me. The report includes a list of recommendations for the NHS in England, much of which can be implemented in Scotland too. So will the First Minister now take responsibility and urgently look at how we can implement the recommendations of the report in Scotland? Will she ensure that there is a debate in government time on the report immediately after recess? And will she commit to the NHS paying for women to travel abroad for full mesh removal, as the Canadian Government have done?
First Minister.
The Health Secretary confirmed yesterday that we would consider the recommendations in the Cumberland report for their applicability to Scotland, and we will respond in full to the report. I understand the Health Secretary has a meeting with certain members, I think including Neil Findlay, to discuss issues around mesh very soon. We will also continue to consider issues of how we support women to get the treatment that they feel and understandably and rightly feel that they need, and that will be part of that consideration. Of course, we have recently announced the establishment of a support fund to help women with some of the other costs associated with the difficulties around the mesh treatment that they have had. So the Health Secretary will be able to give a fuller update to the members she meets with next week, and I'm happy to give an undertaking that although it's for the Business Bureau to decide this, that there should be a parliamentary debate when it is appropriate and when we've had the chance to consider the recommendations in full, and as soon as possible after the end of recess would be, I think, something that we could all support.
Willie Coffey to be followed by Jeremy Balfour.
Thank you. Can I ask the First Minister a question on behalf of our shielded group, most of whom have been isolating since March? They'll be pleased to learn of the latest relaxations announced yesterday, but could I ask the First Minister if more might be done with the tourism and hospitality sectors to think about setting aside safe zones or safe spaces for our shielders so that they might also be able to enjoy many of the facilities that the rest of us will shortly start to enjoy once again?
First Minister.
Yeah, I think that's a good and reasonable suggestion that we'll certainly take up with different sectors. Willie Coffey's right about how difficult this has been and continues to be for those in the shielding category. So the changes that have been announced that will take effect from tomorrow are important, and I hope that they will make a real difference to the quality of life of people who are shielding. It's also the case that many in the shielded category who will be looking forward to the ability to interact more will also be very anxious and nervous about it. So we've produced guidance. We will continue to produce guidance. We've also produced guidance for the hospitality industry, which includes precautions such as regular disinfection and surfaces of objects and surfaces that are touched regularly. I think I said in my statement, but in case I didn't, just to remind anybody watching who is in the shielded category that on the government website today you will find more detail, not just about the changes that will take effect tomorrow, but the further changes that we hope we will be able to announce between now and the end of July, when it is still our hope that the shielding advice can be paused.
Jeremy Balfour to be followed by Jackie Bailey.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The First Minister will be aware that all deaf people, including those who use sign language, need to be able to see someone's face. Will she make sure that all transport providers and shop owners realise that they should not wear a face mask when someone has a hearing issue so that they can communicate clearly with them? And will she make sure that all NHS care workers have clear face masks so that lip reading can take place in an easy fashion?
First Minister.
Yeah, I think that is extremely important, and I think those points are well made. So I will give an undertaking to the member to make sure that we act on all of those, and the right guidance and support is available as he has set out. And I'm happy to ask the Health Secretary to write to him with more detail of that when we have done so.
And Jackie Bailey.
The First Minister, I'm sure, will agree that hospices have done a tremendous job during the pandemic, as they do all year round. They were promised additional resources back in April, some £19 million in Barnett consequentials. So can the First Minister tell me why some hospices have not yet received this money, and will she ensure that the funding is released immediately?
First Minister.
I will double check this, but the Health Secretary is indicating to me that it has already been agreed with the hospice sector that that money will be made available. But since Jackie Bailey seems to have different information, probably it's better if we go away and just double check where things are. But the intention to make sure that money is both available and released and distributed as appropriately is absolute.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid that's all we have time for now. Apologies to members who didn't get a chance to ask their question. Parliament suspended. We'll resume at 2:30. Parliament is suspended.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can I remind members that social distancing measures are in place in the Chamber and across the campus, so please take care to observe those measures, including when entering and exiting the Chamber. The next item of business is a statement by Kate Forbes on a response to the Chancellor's summer economic update. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of her statement, so there should be no interventions or interruptions. And I call on Kate Forbes for up to 20 minutes, please, Cabinet Secretary.
And I welcome this opportunity. Initial response to the Chancellor of the Exchequer's economic update yesterday. And can I start by saying something positive, that I welcome elements of the Chancellor's statement. Last week I called for an £80 billion stimulus package from the UK Government to build a strong, green and inclusive economic recovery. That would be around 4% of GDP, matching the scale of Germany's plan and more in line with the Prime Minister's rhetoric of FDR. So while I support certain measures, not least the reduced VAT for tourism and hospitality, which I'd called for, much of the rest falls short of delivering what I believe is needed to boost the economy and protect jobs. For example, there's no extension to the furlough scheme for hard-hit sectors. There's no further support for households in financial difficulty, and still, now into July, just silence on the question of reasonable fiscal flexibilities for this government to respond appropriately to the pandemic. Indeed, many of the initiatives are short-lived. And rather than providing long-term certainty for businesses or households, they simply push the problems back towards the turn of the year, when we'll also have to contend with the end of the transition period with the EU. The Chancellor's jobs plan may have a headline value of up to £30 billion, but we should be clear that that figure is contingent on demand when some of the measures may prove to be poorly targeted. The figure also comprises the Prime Minister's investment package outlined last week, which we know extends to future years and does not add new money this year. I say all that merely to clarify the facts and the context, because I'm sure we can all agree that accuracy is important. Another fact is that the Chancellor's jobs plan itself generated only £21 million for the Scottish budget, a position confirmed to date by the Fraser of Allender Institute. I appreciate that many of the measures are UK-wide and the England-only spend is mostly recycled from existing budgets. But that disappointing figure is at odds with those being quoted by some parties yesterday. You cannot have both a UK-wide package and significant consequentials. Granted, there was further detail published yesterday separate to the jobs plan, albeit that was nearly all previously trailed measures, such as Monday's culture announcement and belatedly some of the long-promised funding for PPE. These and other previously known measures separate from the Chancellor's statement were reflected in a figure of £800 million consequential uplift that was also being quoted by some yesterday. And whilst that is welcome, it includes only £27 million that we were not already aware of beforehand. And I think it's helpful to be clear about what the various funding amounts relate to. For the record, the currently notified estimate of COVID-related consequentials for the 2020-21 Scottish Budget is £4.6 billion, all resource except for £10 million of capital and financial transactions. And I would reiterate that that is welcome. But even with some simple analysis of the scale of the support needed, whether for businesses, communities or public services, it's clear that that is not enough to fund the recovery sufficiently and balance the budget. And that is why, together with devolved government counterparts, I continue to have constructive dialogue with the Treasury, and my expectation and my hope is that further information is yet to come on the consequential position. And I'll, of course, continue to keep Parliament updated. Presiding Officer, I should also stress that it is not just the funding amounts and lack of flexibilities that matter here. The timeline and the process are crucial too. It's intensely problematic for Scotland's recovery that, again, we have had to wait the culmination of the UK Government policy process and respond to announcements in this way, as our funding position is drip-fed to us, with limited engagement in advance on policies that interact so much with our devolved responsibilities. I was being fully transparent with Parliament in the debate on the 16th of June when I said that this year's resource budget was facing a shortfall of hundreds of millions of pounds. As time passes without the requisite certainty or flexibility from Treasury, we now face the possibility of having to take some critical decisions at fiscal risk. Again, I see this in the spirit of openness and working with the Parliament, as our collective efforts to budget more responsively and strategically are hampered without the prospect either of funding certainty or of any relaxations to the fiscal framework's limitations. I'll now turn from the fiscal position to specific measures. In advance of yesterday's update, I've been working since probably early spring to ensure that the UK Government was fully aware of our concerns and Scotland's needs. And last week, I published a report on the UK fiscal path, which pressed the UK Government to avoid a return to austerity and adopt more flexible fiscal rules. Growing the economy and reducing inequality should take priority over deficit reduction until the economy has fully recovered. And as I alluded to earlier, the report called for a UK-wide fiscal stimulus package worth £80 billion. Such a package would generate funds to enable Scotland to shape its own response to the pandemic, as would temporary loosening of Scotland's fiscal flexibilities and provide a guarantee against negative Barnett consequentials being applied to the budget in the current financial year. I also wrote to the Chancellor on Saturday with some further specific points. We need a national debt plan that promotes fairness as well as economic recovery in response to the significant and widespread increase in debt as a result of COVID-19, which affects all parts of society. For households, that means working with lenders to ensure that loan, mortgage and rent holidays can be extended to those experiencing financial hardship. For businesses, it could mean scrapping interest charges or converting loans to equity managed by public policy banks such as the Scottish National Investment Bank. Young people have been particularly affected by the pandemic, and they are more likely to work in industries affected by closure and less likely to be able to work at home. I recommended a jobs guarantee for young people to ensure that they have access to work, an apprenticeship or training that helps prevent the damaging effects of being out of the labour market at the beginning of their working lives, building on the success of the Edinburgh Guarantee programme. To support consumer confidence, we recommended a temporary reduction in the standard rate of VAT to 15%, coupled with targeted additional measures for vulnerable areas such as hospitality and construction, to support those businesses and boost consumer spending. That would help Scottish households and provide a stimulus to support business. The different devolved administrations share similar views on the general funding position and the need for fiscal flexibilities, and we've worked closely together to make a clear and consistent case to the UK Government now for weeks. I've also worked with parties across this chamber to build consensus on the principle of further fiscal flexibility as reflected in the Parliament's resolution on the 16th of June. Presiding Officer, to help set the context, I'll quickly recap on measures that we have already taken, not waiting for the Chancellor's statement. Colleagues will know that we've already committed a business support package worth over £2.3 billion, and that includes reliefs that will continue over the course of the coming year. We've already moved to implement the £230 million investment package announced last month to help stimulate Scotland's economy, creating jobs in construction, low-carbon initiatives, digitisation and business support by providing a pipeline of work for business. And we've also acted to support the oil and gas industry, which is a critical component of our economy and has a crucial role to play in the transition to net zero. Specifically, we established the £62 million Energy Transition Fund, which will support our energy sector and help us make significant progress as we move towards a net zero society. We also recognise the importance of boosting employability and acted in response. We've already confirmed an initial £33 million for employability in 2020-21, flexing and enhancing existing services to ensure that support is aligned to the challenges we face. And beyond our Communities Fund, we've committed a range of support, including £30 million to provide laptops for disadvantaged children and young people to study online. Now, the Advisory Group on Economic Recovery set out in its recommendations a Scottish job guarantee for young people. We've acted at speed to address that, and last Friday, Sandy Begbie was appointed to lead the implementation plan of that work and will report by the end of July. The recommendations set out the importance of industry leadership. Through our Developing the Young Workforce programme, we have a network of industry-led groups that are well positioned to support the implementation of any guarantee. We're clear that these jobs must be meaningful and must allow young people to develop skills that reflect the emerging opportunities. We must ensure that our young people are supported to make the best of the opportunities, and we're clear that the principles of fair work and payment of the real living wage is essential. Given much of the Chancellor's jobs plan content is new to us, I'm still assessing the detail together with Ministerial colleagues, but offer some initial thoughts here. The incentive payment for employers to bring back employees from furlough is welcome for those that it supports, but the benefit could vary depending on different businesses' prospects for a return to full operation, and that may risk the scheme missing its target level of support. On tax, I welcome the temporary cut in VAT for tourism and hospitality. That is something that we've argued for, not just for weeks, but indeed for years, and I'm pleased to see that the Chancellor has heeded those calls. But the statement missed the opportunity to cut taxes for employers. We argued that the stimulus package should finance a 2p cut in employers' national insurance contributions to reduce the cost to businesses of hiring staff, but the Chancellor has not taken action on that. Now turning to the Chancellor's announcement yesterday on stamp duty land tax. I've heard calls for me to replicate that change in Scotland under land and buildings transaction tax. We have a strong record on LBTT due to the reforms that we've previously taken. Our higher starting threshold of £145,000 in Scotland has meant that around half of all transactions paid no tax. We continue to focus support on first-time buyers and in assisting people as they progress through the property market. I've listened to calls for me to raise the starting threshold to LBTT to help stimulate housing market activity and the economy. It's important, though, that any change made in Scotland is focused directly on the particular needs of the Scottish economy. And so today, I can announce that I will increase the starting threshold for residential LBTT from £145,000 to £250,000. Because of the time required to prepare legislation and for Revenue Scotland to be ready to collect and manage the tax, the change will not come into force immediately. But I'll work to enable this to be introduced as soon as possible. The rates for the additional dwelling supplement and non-residential LBTT remain unchanged. That means that 8 out of 10 people purchasing a property in Scotland will be taken out of LBTT, excluding the additional dwelling supplement. And all home movers purchasing a property above £250,000 will be £2,100 better off. While changes to LBTT offer support to all those purchasing a home, this is a blanket measure and one which may not help first-time buyers. I'm also heeding the warning from the Institute of Fiscal Studies this morning that first-time buyers, and I quote, are a group that might actually be made worse off by the UK Government's policy. I'm pleased, therefore, to also announce today further targeted support for those who may be most concerned about making such an investment at this time. The Scottish Government's first home fund was launched in December 2019. Even prior to COVID, it had been welcomed by stakeholders and take-up had been high. As a result of pent-up demand having been released following the end of stay-at-home measures and reflecting the more limited availability of higher loan-to-value mortgages in the market, demand for support is likely to outstrip current funding. I'm therefore providing an additional £50 million this financial year to directly support first-time buyers with their deposits, recycling underspend in the Scottish Government's financial transactions budget. That will support an estimated additional 2,000 first-time buyer purchases and lifts the total funding for this targeted measure to £200 million. By taking a distinctive approach in Scotland to raising the starting threshold under LBTT, I'm able to target further support elsewhere and to target it where the UK Government failed to provide funding to devolved administrations. The Chancellor's announcement of support for the economy and jobs yesterday resulted in just £21 million of consequentials for the Scottish Government. While clearly there are UK-wide schemes that will apply in Scotland, our assessment is that much more support is required for the labour market. That is why I'm committing today that we will make an additional £100 million available this year for targeted employment support and training to help keep people in work or help them retrain. Even alongside the Chancellor's Youth Employment Scheme, this is unlikely to be all that we will need to do to support employment and skills over the next year, but it is a first step, and the Economy Secretary will set out the policy details to Parliament soon. Beyond these initial actions, we'll consider the UK Government's announcements and their impact on Scotland more closely and respond more fully, and I welcome contributions on the detail from across the Chamber. Presiding Officer, I continue to seek to engage Parliament at every step of our fiscal response to COVID-19, reflecting the Government's route map and the evolving challenges for businesses, communities and public services. Following the summer budget revision, which set out more than £4 billion of spending to address COVID, I'll continue with the collaborative approach looking ahead to the autumn budget revision and, of course, the 2021-22 budget process. The Chancellor's economic update provided an opportunity for the UK Government to explain how it will support the Scottish economy, along with the rest of the UK economy, to recover from the impact of the COVID-19 outbreak. While the update showed that the UK Government is willing to act, we'll continue to press for action that better meets the needs of Scotland in the areas where this Parliament does not have the power to act. The Scottish Government's ambition is to work towards the elimination of COVID-19 in Scotland and for the Scottish economy to return to delivering prosperity and growth. In order to achieve that, I have set out to the UK Government the additional, focused, limited and temporary fiscal flexibilities that we seek, and we will continue to liaise constructively and in the hope that they will heed those calls. As I have said, under the current arrangements, our budgeting approach and timetable in response to this crisis continues to be heavily contingent on that of the UK Government. The fiscal powers we are seeking would enable the Scottish Government to respond to COVID-19 more effectively and reboot our economy. They are relatively limited powers. I'm still not quite sure why we're debating it, but they would ease some of the immense pressures on our budget and give us more tools to kickstart our recovery. It's also essential that the UK Government provides early clarity on its plans for the spending review and the budget this autumn to enable us to plan and contribute. Despite the Chancellor outlining measures worth up to £30 billion yesterday, most of it bypasses devolution and does not provide the Scottish Government with the funding that we need to enable us to tailor an economic response that meets Scotland's needs. Like all governments, we are facing huge spending pressures, but we don't have the tools that others have to meet them. And along with the governments of Wales and Northern Ireland, we have set out a reasonable, a proportionate set of new financial powers that would enable the Scottish Government to respond more effectively. This Parliament has voiced its support for that principle, and I dearly hope the UK Government will listen and will act.
The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the issues raised in her statement, and I'll allow around 40 minutes for that. It would be helpful if those members who wish to ask a question would press the request to speak buttons now, and I call on Donald Cameron.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for prior sight of her statement? The truth is that yesterday Rishi Sunak announced an ambitious plan for the whole of the UK, incentivising employment with a job retention bonus scheme and cutting tax for hard-pressed sectors such as hospitality, measures which will directly benefit Scottish workers and business. Far from bypassing devolution, this is devolution working, with the UK government continuing to inject unprecedented funds directly into the Scottish economy. It is, of course, still not enough for the SNP government, even though yesterday's announcement was warmly welcomed by the FSB, the Scottish Chambers of Commerce and the Scottish Tourism Alliance, to name but a few. Rishi Sunak's cut to stamp duty plainly doesn't apply to Scotland, and while the Cabinet Secretary has just announced a tax break for LBTT up to $250,000, there remains a significant disparity between Scotland and the rest of the UK. So can she explain why she is not committing to a fully equivalent cut for LBTT, and also explain why it cannot be done immediately, given that there will now be a massive incentive to delay and thus cause disruption to the market at that bracket?
Kate Forbes.
Well, rather than talking about the wonderful benefits of the union, for devolution to work properly, we need adequate funding. And the Tories regularly stand up in this chamber making demands of the Scottish Government to act further, to move further and to put in place our own economic stimulus. And indeed, Donald Cameron has just done that. But here's the point for the Scottish Tories. You cannot make demands if you deny us both the powers and the funding to do it. Now, the UK Government's announcement yesterday are welcome. I have put on record my welcome of the VAT cut and the wider support for businesses. But there's no getting round it. It does bypass devolution. Now, on to land and buildings transaction tax. The two answers. The first one is that 8 out of 10 buyers in Scotland will be taken out of paying LBTT. As Donald Cameron will know full well, the Scottish housing market is slightly, or rather a lot, different to the rest of the UK. And so tax devolution is about separate tax policies for Scotland, not just about matching those in the rest of the UK. And he will also know full well that the block grant adjustment, which hasn't quite been confirmed by the UK Government, does not allow us to fully replicate decisions that are made elsewhere. In terms of why it cannot be done immediately, that is, we will respond as quickly as we can in the circumstances. I had no advance warning of the intention yesterday to make a change to SDLT. I heard when everybody else did. And having made clear that time is required to prepare legislation and for Revenue Scotland to be ready to collect and manage the tax, we will move quickly. The alternative would have been to say nothing and to create even more uncertainty in the market. So I've chosen to give that clarity, understanding fully the limits on the legislative process and the challenge for Revenue Scotland.
Jackie Bailey.
And I welcome the package of measures from the UK Government, but it can only be viewed as a first step in tackling the economic crisis. When considering the scale of the economic stimulus in France at €15 billion, Germany at €14 billion, then the €3 billion from the UK Government is much, much less than required. So my first question to the Cabinet Secretary is what proportion of the Scottish budget is she able to set aside to deal with economic recovery? Secondly, can I welcome her announcement about LBTT, but she will be aware that any delay in implementation does cause postponement in house sales and purchases, and that is unhelpful to the housing market. So can she tell us how quickly she will move to put legislation in place? What is that time delay? And lastly, Presiding Officer, let me welcome the £100 million announced by the Cabinet Secretary for Finance for youth unemployment. But given that she has only received 21 million of consequentials, can she set out for the Chamber where this money is coming from?
In terms of the money that we have set aside on economic recovery, we've already taken the early steps that I indicated in my statement around ensuring that any capital underspend is recycled to ensure it provides jobs. But as she will know, there is significant investment through our budget already. There's £2.3 billion in terms of initial response to businesses. But here's the challenge, and this is why yesterday was an incredibly frustrating day, because in order to provide additional support, she knows full well that the primary source of additional finance for the Scottish Government is through the UK Government consequentials. And for all the talk of the 800 million, which is warmly welcome, it is largely for PPE and funding announcements that have already been made. In terms of additional resource that are from the economic stimulus package, there is only 21 million. We will use every penny of that to continue to invest in the economy. But until there is additional support, then it will be very difficult to do that without having one hand tied behind our back. Of course, if we had more significant borrowing powers, that would be much easier to do. In terms of how quickly we can move, we will move incredibly fast. It's not a problem with Scottish ministers. We will move quickly. There is a legislative process to go through, and Revenue Scotland need to be ready so that that change can be introduced effectively and efficiently. So we will move very quickly. I cannot put a precise date on it just now, and I don't think that would be particularly helpful in terms of the uncertainty in the market. In terms of youth unemployment, we are aware that we will need to do far more. And the Cabinet Secretary for the Economy, it will next week set out a far more comprehensive and detailed package of policies to support people getting back into work and protecting jobs. And so there will be significant detail included in that. But I agree with her that it will need to be much more. And the challenge will be, as I look across the budget, to make sure we free up any headroom available. There isn't much. but free up any headroom available to have that singular focus on protecting and creating jobs.
We move to the open questions. Can I remind those who wish to ask a question to press their request to speak buttons, please? And I first of all call Patrick Harvey, to be followed by Willie Rennie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In relation to the measures on hospitality in particular, I'm looking forward to getting back to the pub as much as anybody, but I want to do it when it's safe, and I also want to do it when I know that the people working there are being treated decently. So the announcements from the UK government on this have come in the same week that we've heard that the G1 Group in Glasgow, one of our biggest hospitality employers, is announcing another wave of redundancies. It seems that they're doing that well in advance of the end of the furlough scheme, which could keep those jobs going a bit longer. And the union organisers in Unite Hospitality also tell me that the staff affected have not been consulted with in advance in the way that they're supposed to be, that younger workers who've had less than 2 years service are being particularly targeted because they don't have the same employment rights. And there is a genuine concern that the employer is using furlough money to pay people's wages in lieu, which even the UK Treasury wants to rule out. So what can the Scottish Government do to ensure that employers are not abusing the measures that are put in place, that we don't see recovery becoming another race to the bottom on wages and employment standards, and that we actually ensure a sector with endemic problems of poverty pay changes and starts to look after the people who do the work that earn their profits?
Kate Forbes.
Thanks. Well, the first point I'd make is that employers are starting to make decisions about redundancies in part because they know that the furlough scheme is coming to an end and that there is a cliff edge in October. And there was an option for the Chancellor yesterday to extend the furlough scheme, albeit on a sectoral basis, on a phased basis, like France has done for up to 2 years. And that, I think, would mean that avert the rapid increase in redundancies, particularly in the hospitality sector. But the point he makes about ensuring that there are fair work practices in place is important. And I can assure him that all of our support for employability and skills and retraining and support for businesses to keep people in work will have fair work at its heart. As I said, Fiona Hislop will set out the details of that soon, but our assurance is that it will ensure that the individual, particularly young people who are finding themselves in one of the most challenging job markets in a generation, have that support, not just to be in work, but also to have a fair wage and have meaningful contracts.
Willie Rennie, to be followed by Bruce Crawford.
I thank the Finance Secretary for an advance sight of her statement, even if it was titled as from the First Minister. I'm not sure if she had a hand in that. She will hopefully be aware of my colleagues Jamie Stone MP's work to stand up for financial support for the excluded, the self-employed, freelancers and others who have been left behind. In our future discussions with the Chancellor, will she raise this important issue with him, and will she commit her government to support these people too?
Kate Forbes.
The answer is yes. I have already raised those points quite a number of times in particularly my quad calls with with the UK Government and also the Welsh and the Northern Irish Executive representatives, and I'll continue to do that. And in terms of going forward, we will make sure that funding that we put in place tries to catch everybody. He'll know that in terms of the initial response, we already moved further to ensure, for example, the newly self-employed got support. We can't do that for everybody, but we have moved further where we can. Of course, the two things that are hindering us is access to funding and relaxed fiscal powers. If we had both of those, then we would be able to go even further.
Bruce Crawford, followed by Maurice Golden.
Thank you, President Officer. Many of us here at Holyrood welcomed much of what the Chancellor announced yesterday to protect jobs and the economy. But Cabinet Secretary, would you agree with me that it's equally true to say that what was missing from the announcement that caused great concern? Prior to the announcement, the finance ministers from all three devolved nations very reasonably asked the Chancellor to ease current financial restrictions on devolved governments, which would enable each nation to kickstart their own recoveries. Cabinet Secretary, is it therefore not deeply disappointing that the Tory government has ignored these calls?
Kate Forbes.
It is very disappointing. We made those calls in good faith. We have been reasonable. we've set out the bare minimum of what is required in order to reboot the economy and give us as much flexibility to use our budget effectively. This does not cost the UK government anything, but it would make an enormous difference to Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland. We have made those calls for weeks. And I think for all that the Chancellor may have said yesterday about the union, the one thing he could do is actually to make devolution work better by listening to our reasonable calls and acting. This is not about technical powers divorced from reality. This is about us being able to invest in the economy, support communities and protect jobs.
Maurice Golden, followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Yesterday, the British Government gave Scotland's tourism and hospitality sector a massive boost by reducing VAT to just 5%. The Chancellor is doing whatever it takes to directly help individuals and businesses in Scotland, unlike the SNP, who are only interested in playing tribal constitutional politics. So, will the Finance Secretary now play her part in helping Scotland by extending the current business rates holiday for as long as is needed?
Kate Forbes.
I didn't hear the end of that.
It was difficult. I found it difficult to hear the end of Mr Golden's question. I would very much like to hear it again. Not the whole thing.
Just the last 3
Just
seconds.
the last bit.
So, will the Finance Secretary now play her part in helping Scotland by extending the current business rates holiday for as long as is needed?
Kate Forbes.
Can I just put on record that I will do whatever it takes? I have said that we will use all of the resources at our disposal. We will use all of the fiscal levers at our disposal to protect jobs and to reboot the economy. The point I am making is that if the Scottish Tories stand up making demands, they must tell me where the funding will come from or give us the powers to do it ourselves. In terms of the non-domestic rates, that is an obvious example of another request that has not come with consequential funding attached. Therefore, whilst I'm very sympathetic to the argument, I'd like to know what part of the budget that money should come from, because we cannot borrow revenue in order to extend those grants, and I cannot recycle money from one part of my budget to the other because of arcane fiscal rules. And so that is the problem here. For all the demands they make, they must give us the powers or the funding to do it.
Kenneth Gibson, followed by Alex Rowley.
Presiding Officer, UK gross domestic product last year was £2.21 trillion. The Chancellor's economic boost, announced to great fanfare, amounted to barely 1.3% of that, despite the UK economy shrinking by more than 20% in April alone. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree with the Confederation of British Industry predicting a further 3.5% contraction in the economy next year as a direct result of Brexit? That much more needs to be done, including rebalancing taxes paid by high street retailers with online businesses if our town centres are not to suffer continuing decline and further job losses, another 5,300 having been announced by Boots and John Lewis only today.
Kate Forbes.
Well, I think that the scale of the economic challenge that we're facing requires an ambitious and practical response. And I think it's highly likely that the Chancellor will most likely have to come back for more. And I think he's delayed a lot of the more significant announcements to the autumn. In terms of the plan yesterday, yes, we know that there has been and will continue to be a contraction in the economy. We know from our own Scottish Government analysis that it's unlikely to be a V-shaped recovery and instead will more likely be a protracted economic recovery. And that's why we need to look not just to the short term but to the long term. We know that a lot of the welcome initiatives that were announced yesterday have a short shelf life. VAT reduction will come to an end in January, the middle of winter, at the hardest point for the tourism industry. We know that the support for wages and jobs will also come to an end in that time period. So the point is, looking further ahead, we need to make sure that there's support in place to support the Scottish economy in particular.
Alex Rowley, followed, I hope, by Emma Harper joining us remotely. Alex Rowley.
It is deeply disappointing, Presiding Officer, that the Chancellor completely ignored the calls from devolved administrations for greater flexibility and for greater borrowing powers. Labour will continue to work with the Scottish Government to push on these issues. The Cabinet Secretary talk specifically about the LBTT and house building and support for new house buyers. Can I say to her that this is an opportunity for us to look at housing on the whole and look at what kind of ambitious housing programme, a national programme for housing that will join all the bits together. And specifically, she'll have seen the calls for Shelter Scotland for an extension of the no eviction policy for people struggling to pay their rent. And will she agree, as part of looking at that we need a national house build programme for Scotland that will bring about real-term, sustainable jobs, training opportunities and apprenticeships? And will she agree to look at bringing forward such a programme and look at housing on the whole rather than parts of?
Kate Forbes.
I think that that's a very helpful offer at the outset for to work with us in terms of the fiscal flexibilities, because, as I said, this has cross-government support, it has cross-party support, and there's a lot of independent think tanks and commentators that have also expressed their support for something that, as I say, doesn't cost the UK government anything, but does support the Scottish economy. In terms of the ambition for housing, the member will know about our ambition to date and our target of 50,000 homes, new homes by the end of this Parliament, and the work that's gone in to investing in new homes. And that kind of ambition, that level of ambition, is something that we want to see continued. In terms of the extension of no eviction policies, again, one of the comments I made in the fiscal pathways was around the national debt plan and recognising that those who are already in debt are most likely to go after high cost credit, and also most likely to face challenges around things like evictions and otherwise. And as we come through recovery, as we start to ease lockdown, those pressures are not going to disappear. So I think there is a case to be made for how we continue to support and help households with their household finances.
Emma Harper, followed by Alexander Burnett.
To ask the Cabinet Secretary how the announcement from the UK Chancellor, along with support which has already been put in place by the Scottish Government, will assist cultural organisations, including those across Dumfries and Galloway, like the Big Burn Supper, the Stranraer Oyster Festival and Kirkcudbright Arts Festivals, and whether she will provide assurances that any money ring-fenced for these organisations will go to this sector.
Kate Forbes.
Again, in the spirit of being positive, let me say how much I welcomed the UK Government's announcement last week of the investment in culture, because it recognises the severe impact of the pandemic on those sectors in particularly. And we hope that the UK Government acts swiftly to share information on how the grants and loans will work, following which we will establish the best means to provide additional support to those devastated by COVID-19. We are, as you would appreciate, continually in discussions with Creative Scotland, and now following the £10 million that we have already made available for performing arts venues, we'll look at how we ensure that that funding gets out the door as quickly as possible to those who need it most.
Alexander Burnett, followed by George Adam.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I note members to my register of interest. Now, we all welcome business support grants and the Finance Secretary's initial confirmation that the deadline would be the 31st of March 2021. And we were disappointed but understood the change of plan to close the scheme early so that remaining money could be repurposed, as she repeated just now. However, the scheme closes tomorrow and there is no replacement. Businesses, including those in events management and catering, who have received nothing so far, would have been waiting to hear the replacement scheme today. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, when will she repurpose or provide additional funds for these businesses?
Kate Forbes.
Well, we keep our funding under review at all times. I'm not aware of having promised to replace a new scheme, but we will ensure that funding continues to be made available to businesses that need it most. And as you will already know, parts of that have already been repurposed to ensure that our funding goes even further through the Pivotal Enterprise Resilience Fund and through the hardship scheme, neither of which exist south of the border and neither of which received consequentials to make it happen. But we will keep that funding under review and hope to continue to work with business organisations to identify those who need the funding the most.
George Adam, followed by Sarah Boyack.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree with me
that while the Chancellor's announcement of a £30 billion package of support for jobs is welcome, the UK Government has yet again bypassed devolution. And as a result, the Scottish Government will only receive £21 million to support jobs and the economy. Cabinet Secretary, surely this is a missed opportunity to ensure that we have an approach to jobs that is tailored for Scotland's economy.
Kate Forbes.
The incredible arguments that were being made yesterday about this both being a UK-wide initiative and generating consequentials cannot be true. You cannot have both of those facts existing together. And I hope I laid out in my statement where the different elements come into the overall package. But the overall package, whilst very welcome in parts, particularly the cut in VAT, is a missed opportunity that doesn't give us the funding that we need to tailor our response to Scotland's economy. We will continue to work with industry and will continue to engage with the UK Government in order to ensure that the Scottish Government has the resources that it needs.
Sarah Boyack, followed by Sandra White.
Will the Cabinet Secretary commit to forwarding on all the new consequentials to local government without delay from last week's announcement by Robert Jenrick and the remaining business grants not yet used? And will she act now to give local government financial flexibility and change primary legislation urgently so councils don't have to produce balanced budgets given the crisis, so they can reprofile their deficit given the urgent challenges they face trying to reopen services safely, retain jobs and help support our local economies through investment?
Kate Forbes.
Two brief answers to that. First, yes, we're already working with local government looking at financial flexibilities, and we'll do that. Most of the asks are about legislation that is reserved, but we are closely working, and I speak regularly to Gail McGregor on what those flexibilities would be. In terms of the UK Government's announcement last week, a further £500 million of funding and the scheme to reimburse lost income, we are working with COSLA, but also pressing the UK Government to provide urgent further details on how the fiscal flexibilities can be applied for local authorities in Scotland, and as yet do not have the full certainty and transparency on how that will work.
Sandra White, followed by Mark MacDonald.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Cabinet Secretary, there's been a lot of talk about fiscal stimulus and fiscal flexibilities, and I quite understand that. But as others have mentioned, and I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary will agree with me, that what is basically needed is transfer of powers to borrow. That is absolutely important. And can the Cabinet Secretary please let it be known that monies which are given, as has been said, from Westminster to Scotland is not monies that is given, it is monies that we pay our taxes towards.
Kate Forbes.
Absolutely. These are not gifts. The Scottish taxpayer pays for it, and the Scottish taxpayer will contribute towards the bill at the end. And in terms of borrowing, again, the UK Government has, and it's welcome, funded most of the interventions through record low interest rate borrowing. We have borrowing powers that are all well and good in normal times, but for an extraordinary crisis like this, they do not work. And these very simple requests we've made about repurposing those borrowing powers would make all the difference to allow us to be flexible in our response and to ensure that hard-pressed households and budgets across the country have the support they need.
Mark MacDonald, followed by Ruth Maguire.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I fully support the calls from the Cabinet Secretary for greater flexibility and powers to enable Scottish-specific solutions. We can ask the Cabinet Secretary about a potential flexibility that she could look to introduce. First business in my constituency has received their rates bill, and an increase of 10% is to be applied, despite their income currently being down 75%. You have a look at how that system is operating, and what she consider when she looks at the further business support that she alluded to in response to Alexander Burnett, whether some flexibility might be accorded to areas such as Aberdeen, where rateable values are historically high due to historic economic buoyancy, and thus many businesses of comparable sizes to those elsewhere in Scotland often miss out on support because of their rateable value.
Kate Forbes.
I think two answers in response to that. The first is on rates relief. Of course, the challenges around paying rates is the very reason that we introduce such wide-ranging rates relief. But we've said from the beginning that where a business isn't caught within the criteria for rates relief and feels unable to pay, they should speak to their local authorities in the first instance about what might be able to be done in order to help and support them. In terms of rateable values, of course, a lot of businesses will be getting 100% rates relief right now. Leisure, retail, hospitality and the aviation sectors are all paying no rates at all. But clearly, looking further ahead, beyond the end of this year, we'll take decisions about any extension to that as part of the budget process.
Ruth Maguire, followed by Dean Lockhart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. North Ayrshire is at risk of being particularly hard hit by any economic harms. The Ayrshire Growth Deal can be part of the solution to that. It's crucial that it's signed and money is released so that work can begin and the potential benefits to my Ayrshire constituents can be realised. Will the Cabinet Secretary commit to that and urge UK Government counterparts to do the same?
Kate Forbes.
We are very much committed to signing a deal for Ayrshire as soon as possible, and Michael Matheson made that point clear to UK Government colleagues on a call with Ian Stewart, the Minister at the Scotland office last week. So we'll continue to press the UK Government on the matter in order that communities in Ayrshire can start to benefit from a growth deal investment without further delay.
Dean Lockhart, followed by Neil Findlay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Finance Secretary, instead of just asking for more money from the UK Government, people want to know how the Scottish Government is using its own budget. For example, the Scottish National Investment Bank has a budget of £500 million, which is coming from financial transactions money from the UK Treasury. Will the Finance Secretary today provide a commitment that all of this budget will be used to save existing viable businesses in Scotland, rather than being wasted on speculative projects of this government, which resulted in a loss of £150 million last year alone?
Kate Forbes.
Tories, instead of asking for more funding, perhaps they could give me the means by which to raise that funding in the first place. Now, we are using all of our budget, we are using every line of our budget to ensure that we are responding to COVID and rebooting the economy. Now, I do not know what speculative projects Dean Lockhart is talking about, but it would be wise for him to consider the fact that the rules right now prohibit me from using money saved from projects that don't go ahead in other parts of the budget. And that is one of the arcane rules, and he has made the point for me as to why those rules need relaxed.
Neil Findlay, followed by Rona Mackay.
I have to say, Presiding Officer, this is a depressing session of this Parliament because people's jobs are at risk now. And if all we get is infantile stuff from the Tories, then this is what we'll see, overseeing jobs go down the tubes with nothing happening on the ground. The Social Market Foundation report last week identified West Lothian is likely to be the worst hit area of the recession that is with us now. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary a very specific question? What targeted support will go to my area of West Lothian to prevent a repeat of the 1980s, where we had unemployment at 23%, and in some council schemes we had youth unemployment at 77%?
Kate Forbes.
Precisely what we want to repeat. We want to prevent a repeat of. We also want to repent. But that is precisely what we want to prevent a repeat of. And in terms of the funding that is being made available today, the policy of that, the detailed policies around that in terms of what will be done to support people will be outlined next week. But as it is, where businesses and organisations have indicated that they are going to go through redundancies, we are willing to step in and provide as much support as possible, because the bottom line is that we want to ensure that people stay in work and that we create new jobs for those that have already been made redundant.
Rona Mackay, followed by Michelle Ballantyne.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. A key principle of fair work is fair pay. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that the UK Government should be ensuring that young people using the Kickstarter job creation scheme are paid at least the real living wage?
Kate Forbes.
Absolutely, and whilst we welcome support for young people, the UK Government made this announcement without any consultation with the Scottish Government, and the Cabinet Secretary for the Economy will be writing to the UK Government to express concern on that matter. We're clear that these jobs must be meaningful and allow young people to develop skills that reflect the emerging opportunities. And we need to ensure that our young people are supported to make the best of the opportunities. That has got to have the principles of fair work and payment of the real living wage right at its heart.
Michelle Ballantyne, followed by Graham Simpson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. David Phillips, Associate Director of the Institute of Fiscal Studies, has said today that the Cabinet Secretary's claim that the Scottish Government will only receive 21 million is not true. So can I ask, is your figure clever political spin? And in the light of your response to Sandra White, can you tell me and confirm if you believe that the total budget that is coming to Scotland this year is less than, equal to or more than the fiscal framework actually, if the fiscal framework gives you that in relation to the amount of tax that is... Would you like me to repeat it? Okay, that's fine. Do you believe that Scotland gets more money through the fiscal framework than it takes in taxes in Scotland? So do we benefit as a union together?
Kate Forbes. Well, I think that question perhaps suggests why Michelle Ballantyne missed the detail in my statement, where I made it very, very clear that of the £30 billion of economic stimulus money, only 21 million is coming to the Scottish Government. That figure was reinforced by the Fraser of Allender Institute this morning. I didn't quite follow the rest of her argument or her statement, but the point I would make is that the cost of responding to COVID far outstrips the consequentials that we have received. And unless and until we are given additional powers to raise that money ourselves, I will continue to press the UK Government to provide adequate funding for the response that we need to make.
The last question is to Graham Simpson.
Thank you. The change to the starting rate on LBTT is to be welcomed as far as it goes. But by delaying its implementation, it just means that people won't buy and sell houses until it comes in. So can the Cabinet Secretary at least give an indication of when this change will come in? Will it be this month? Will it be next month? Will it be the month after? Because I think the market needs to know.
Kate Forbes.
Respectfully, I would start by saying, by making the announcement yesterday, without any consultation with the Scottish Government, the UK Government has already stalled the housing market in Scotland because people will be waiting for confirmation. And that is why I've provided clarity today and why I've committed to ensuring that both the legislative process and Revenue Scotland can work as quickly as possible to put that in place. And I think that would be better than having introduced even more uncertainty by delaying any announcements. But where tax decisions are made by the UK Government that have an impact on Scotland and where we get no advance notice of that, we have to make do with what we've got.
That concludes questions on the Cabinet Secretary's response to the Chancellor's summer economic update, and we'll move on to the next item of business. Thank you.
The next item of business is a statement by Richard Lochhead on supporting further and higher education. The Minister will take questions at the end of his statement, so there should be no interventions or interruptions. And I call on Richard Leonard. Minister, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. In the midst of this global health crisis, I want to start by paying tribute to our world-leading universities and colleges in Scotland. The pandemic has placed unprecedented demands on the sector, yet the response of our colleges and universities has, as I'm sure we'll all agree, been quite remarkable, given how quickly they've had to adapt to a new set of very challenging circumstances they could never, ever have imagined. But they have risen to the challenges, and we thank them for it. I also want to put on record the significant work underway in the community learning and development sector to support some of Scotland's most vulnerable adults and young people as well. That sector continues to deliver essential support despite, again, the challenges of COVID-19. And I want all of the people working in that sector to know that their efforts have very much been recognised and are very much appreciated by the Scottish Government and indeed this Parliament. Deputy Presiding Officer, we know the pandemic is an unprecedented external shock. It requires government and institutions to work very closely together. And that's why I set up a leadership group as early as March when the impact first began to emerge. And that group brings together senior leaders across post-16 education, from principals to union leaders to student representatives, where we could get round a virtual table on a regular basis to discuss how best to respond to this significant crisis. And it's overseeing our work on a wide range of issues, including financial sustainability and digital poverty. And I'd like to thank all the members of the group for their tireless efforts. The fact remains that COVID-19 is having a massive impact on our further and higher education sectors, on international student mobility, to a drop in commercial income and in charitable and industry-related research income, and other factors that all combined pose potentially a huge challenge to the sector, albeit we don't know and won't know for some time the full extent of that challenge. Of course, it's not just a Scottish or UK problem, this is a global problem. And today I've published a summary of our immediate support for our institutions and how we are looking towards what may be needed in the future as well. And our further and higher education sustainability plan includes additional resources. We have now provided the £75 million to protect world-leading research in our institutions, £10 million for estates development, development of an international student action plan, additional £5 million across further and higher education for student support, and early access to £11.4 million of HE hardship funds as well. And importantly, our universities will also have access to grants and substantial long-term low-interest loans that the UK Government announced on the 27th of June related to research. And I think it's really important that we are clear about one critical point, and that is that our colleges and universities absolutely deserve the utmost support because they are vital to the solution that Scotland needs to get through and out of this crisis. A fact, indeed, that was recognised in the recently published Benny Higgins report towards the robust, resilient wellbeing economy for Scotland. And that's one key reason why I asked the Scottish Funding Council to lead a review of the provision and financial sustainability to ensure they are able to play that role. Its work will shape an important part of the Government's thinking on future strategy for tertiary education in Scotland. Institutional health is one aspect of the plan, but support for students is another as well. And online learning in particular has arrived with a bang for much of the sector. And so have some of the subsequent challenges from that, such as some learners being unable to enjoy the full benefits of connectivity. On digital support, the Scottish Government has already invested over £40 million in supporting access to digital technology. And today I can announce that we will go further and invest an additional £5 million to help bridge the digital divide for students in Scotland as well. This will see investment in adaptive technologies for students with disabilities, increased online support, and for the most disadvantaged, provided devices that they need to have access to for their learning. And I am pleased to say that our colleges and our universities will be open for business after the summer. Students from Scotland and the rest of the UK and overseas can be absolutely confident of receiving the benefits of an excellent Scottish education. And as the First Minister said in her message to international students just a few days ago, our prime focus will also be on their safety. From Monday the 13th of July, time-sensitive mandatory or regulated skills assessments that are essential to the completion of modern apprenticeship qualifications, or to comply with a legal obligation can resume in their colleges. And from the 22nd of July, colleges and universities can begin a phased return to on-campus learning as part of a blended model with remote teaching. And appropriate safety measures, including physical distancing, will of course be in place. 2 metres physical distancing remains the default, and institutions should continue to plan for the new term on that basis. However, as we've entered phase 3 of the route map and move forward, exemptions will be considered for specific sectors and settings where agreed additional mitigations must be put in place. That would allow organisations in these relevant sectors, if they choose, to operate with a 1 metre distance on condition that agreed mitigations, fully recorded risk assessments are implemented. And we are now looking at whether such exemptions may be applied to colleges and universities in certain circumstances. We will provide an update on this work as soon as we can. Our approach throughout this crisis has been to ensure the continued safety of staff and students, and I want to be clear that that remains our absolute priority. I know that for prospective and continuing students, this has been a worrying and uncertain time. But our institutions remain world-class, welcoming and open, and with the measures set out in our guidance, will remain safe. And today's new UCAS figures showing a 16% increase in the number of non-EU applications to our universities, the highest in the UK, is an encouraging sign that that message is hopefully now getting through. But as if the monumental COVID-19 challenge wasn't enough, the challenge of Brexit is also about to become very real as well. COVID coincides with Brexit, presenting a double whammy for our universities and our colleges. And let me remind the Chamber, this is a UK government that turned its back on Europe, not Scotland. But now that chaotic handling of the entire Brexit process jeopardises the future success of our colleges and universities and our students and our young people. These institutions, our students and young people and our research excellence have all disproportionately benefited from EU membership compared to their UK counterparts and will now be disproportionately harmed. The Scottish Government has always been clear that its overwhelming priority is for Scotland to remain a part of Erasmus Plus and Horizon 2020 for their unparalleled education, cultural and economic benefits. Scotland gains a huge amount from these programmes and we secure proportionally more funding under both than any other part of the UK. We were told by the UK Government that we would be co-creators in building the UK's future relationship with international mobility. Instead, no one will be surprised in the Chamber to hear that negotiations have been quite frustrating and the tendency to consult us on decisions after they are taken continues, such as the recent decision that any UK alternative to Erasmus would not subsidise inward mobility. We will continue to be open and constructive, but the clock is ticking, and I am afraid the signals on Erasmus point towards a poor outcome for young Scots compared to the advantages that previous generations enjoyed. Equally, there's no good Brexit for university research, and we're also still not any clearer about the future of Horizon 2020. And remember that Audit Scotland warned of a Brexit cost of £211 million to our universities. I will keep Parliament up to date with any progress in these areas. Even though the full impact of Brexit is yet to be seen, I must now set out its effect on EU tuition fees. As a result of EU law, since the Government abolished tuition fees, we have treated EU students in the same way we treat students from Scotland. They don't pay tuition fees. It's only as a result of EU law applying in Scotland that this was possible. Indeed, it was mandatory. Our EU law obligations cease at the end of the transition period in a few months, and continuing with this arrangement for 21-22 would significantly increase the risk of any legal challenge. So following the UK's vote to leave the EU, I have previously announced that the 2021 academic year was a transition year for the policy, and therefore it's with a heavy heart that we have taken a difficult decision to end free education for new EU students from the academic year 2021-2022 onwards as a direct consequence of Brexit. EU students who have already started their studies or who start this autumn will not be affected and will still be tuition-free for the entirety of their courses. This change is a stark reality of Brexit and a painful reminder that our country's decisions are affected by UK policies that we did not support and we didn't vote for. But our internationalism remains a key strength of higher education in Scotland, so we will discuss with the sector an ambitious scholarship programme to ensure the ancient European nation of Scotland continues to attract significant numbers of European students to study here. And as a consequence of the decision we have taken on EU students, we must also decide what happens to the funding that currently supports these places. And I can confirm that we will not remove the funding we currently devote to paying EU student fees from the overall funding for the sector. And in current trends and following further analysis, we estimate this could be up to £19 million for 21-22 alone. And as a result of that decision, this new flexibility for the sector should lead to an increase in the number of students from Scotland getting a place at university. At a time when our young people face the economic impact of COVID-19, and that means no doubt this will provide some significant support at an important time. So in conclusion, as we respond to COVID-19, as we respond to Brexit, I want to emphasise to the Chamber that the continued success of our colleges and universities is crucial. It's crucial to our economic prosperity, it's crucial to our future social well-being, and it must be central to the recovery of this country that we now must build. Our colleges and universities provide our people with life chances and skills, and are the engines that power our society. They are a source of strength for our nation, and we must protect them. And this government will stand by them to meet the challenges and grasp the exciting opportunities that lie ahead. And I hope Parliament will support us as we do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. The Minister will now take questions on the issues raised in his statement. We've got about 20 minutes for questions, after which we will conclude. And it would be helpful if members wish to ask a question to press the request to speak buttons now. And I call on Jamie Green to be followed by Ian Gray. Mr Green, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I thank the Minister for advance sight of his statement today, and can I also pay tribute to those in our colleges and universities, especially the staff who have been faced with unprecedented challenges in these past few difficult months. And like others, I too welcome those who come to Scotland to study. They enrich our campuses and our universities. But equally, we have a duty to deliver fairness for Scottish students. The cessation of the government's policy to offer free university education to EU students in Scotland must come with an upside to Scottish students. Now that there is no longer an obligation to do so, it is only right that those funds must be used to support instead Scottish students in Scottish universities. To do that, the Scottish Government can start by lifting the unfair cap on Scottish domiciled students, which we know denies some 15,000 Scots a place at a university every year in this country. It is a reality, and an appalling one at that, Presiding Officer, that Scottish students with as many as 8 A grades in their hires are rejected from universities, such are the current funding structures. This surely cannot be allowed to continue. And the truth is that today's announcement barely scratches the surface of the deep, cutting financial problems that our sector faces. Way before COVID crisis, the sector faced an estimated black hole of around £500 million. And the stark reality is, Presiding Officer, is that this sector has faced dire financial outcomes for many years under its current structures. Everybody knows that, and today's announcement
Please
will not
get to your
change
question
that.
now, Mr Green.
So let me ask specifically then, let me ask the Minister whether the £97 million that we currently spend on funding EU undergraduates will stay in the higher education sector in its entirety, and in what capacity. How specifically those savings will go towards lifting that cap on university places for Scottish students, and if so, how many places does he think it will free up?
And you must conclude now. You went well over your time. I'm sorry. I said you must conclude. Please sit down. Minister.
I thank Jamie Green for his opening comments. And can I say that I think he paints a very inaccurate picture of what's happening in further higher education at the current time. Over the last couple of years, we've seen record numbers of Scottish students attending Scottish universities. We've seen a growing economic contribution from our universities and higher education to this country as well. It's in a very healthy state. Now we do face the twin challenges of COVID-19 and Brexit, yet it's Jamie Green's party that's foisting Brexit onto the sector that's delivering the only threat it's faced before COVID at the current time as well. We've also seen today, in terms of the new UCAS figures, there's an overall 3% increase in the number of applications to Scottish universities. And as I said in my opening remarks, that includes a 16% increase in non-EU overseas students applying to Scottish universities as well. So that tells me that our sector is performing wonderfully well. It's selling its message to the rest of the world really well at the current time in terms of coming here for quality education in a safe environment, and I congratulate them for that. And as I said in my opening remarks, to answer Jamie's key point, the money that is currently devoted towards EU students as part of the budget will be remaining within the higher education budget. And therefore, at this time when young people will be looking for options, given the potential significant economic downturn, that's good news for a number of Scottish students attending our universities.
Thank you. Ian Gray, followed by Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thanks to the Minister for early sight of his statement. I certainly agree with him that our tertiary education sector will be critical to rebuilding a modern, high-skilled economy driven by research and innovation, and so our universities and colleges must be protected. Yet, prior to the pandemic, they already faced an uncertain financial future. Audit Scotland repeatedly warned us about the financial fragility of colleges, while university funding had been cut by over 11% in recent years. Those UCAS figures that applications are holding up are welcome, but universities still fear that many of those international students will not in fact arrive in September with serious financial consequences. So does the First Minister have a contingency plan for our universities, or is he just crossing our fingers that these students will in fact appear? Secondly, there is no additional financial support here for colleges. Will he at least guarantee the FE settlement in the 2021 budget, even if outcomes are disrupted in that sector? And finally, colleges and universities are planning now for their new terms activities in September. If pubs, restaurants and public transport can be told now to plan for 1 metre social distancing, why can't colleges and universities?
Minister, please.
Thank Ian Gray for his comments. Can I just say at the outset that our universities and our colleges are national assets, and we should be very proud of them. And we have seen an increasing number of students recently. We have seen an increasing number of international students recently. We're seeing research success after research success. So we should not be painting pictures of doom and gloom. Yes, there are financial challenges. And now with the twin challenges of COVID-19 and Brexit, I have asked the Scottish Funding Council to look at many of the points that Ian Gray legitimately raises about the future finances of the sector and how it's funded, and how the funding is used within the sectors to make sure that we are fleet of foot and agile as a country, because there's lots of international competitors out there doing really good things and we can't stand still, and I absolutely accept that. So that's why we have commissioned the Scottish Funding Council. In terms of resources, many of the budgets I mentioned in my opening remarks do apply to colleges, they're further and higher education. And higher education is delivered by colleges as well as by universities, so they do benefit colleges to a significant degree, albeit £75 million for researchers, universities, and I accept that. If we devote more money to college and universities, Ian Gray has to tell us where that money comes out of, because as Kate Forbes has said in her previous statement, we're limited in terms of how we can borrow. Therefore, we rely on consequentials from the UK Government. We've not yet had those consequentials to help us give further support to our colleges and universities. So I urge all members, small parties, to put pressure on the UK Government as well to allow us to do more to help our universities and colleges.
Thank you. I have 11 members with questions. I'd like short questions and short answers, if possible, please. Claire Adamson, followed by Jimmy Halker-Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Minister, in my constituency of Motherwell, Wishaw, many of my constituents benefit from the widening and access agendas of the universities. COVID has compounded the problems that some of these students have in terms of retention, and the fact that they weren't able to claim universal credit over the summer and that jobs are limited, financial strains are there, as well as general societal problems like mental health issues that will be affecting many at this time. So I would just like to ask what conversations you've had with colleges and universities to ensure that one of the unintended consequences here isn't widening social inequality.
Minister.
Thank you. Claire Adamson raises a very important point. And the Deputy First Minister and myself have been discussing regularly what more we can do in the times ahead to support people who will be getting the brunt of the impact of the COVID-19 crisis in Scotland and could be even further away from education as a result of that. And that's why the community learning development sector has a big role to play, as well as our colleges and indeed our universities. At the recent meeting of the leadership group, which I mentioned before, we had the Commissioner for Widening Access speaking to us and giving us some advice of what we can do to make sure there's not too much of a detrimental impact on widening access in this economic crisis that we're potentially facing. So I just want to assure Claire that Claire Adamson, that we are giving due attention to the issues around student hardship and indeed the the impact of the economic crisis on those being further away from education.
Jamie Halford-Johnson, followed by Keith Brown.
I know that both further and higher education institutions stand ready to assist in skill support, vital, as the Minister said, in emerging from the coronavirus outbreak. The First Minister welcomed the proposal from the Higgins Report for Jobs Guarantee Scheme. So can he clarify whether he envisages that education through both colleges and universities will form some part of that scheme, and can he outline what part they could play?
Thank you. Minister.
It's a very good question from Jamie Halcrow-Johnson, and yes, there's no doubt our colleges in particular have a big role to play in taking forward some of these policies, but the details, you can imagine, is being worked out in the coming weeks, and we are having regular discussions with both the Scottish Funding Council and the further and higher education sectors about the role they'll potentially play in making sure that Scotland has the skills pipeline for the post-COVID-19 economy, and that is really, really important. And clearly that's wrapped up in all the issues around apprenticeships and so on. So that is a very important debate, and I'll keep Parliament updated.
Keith Brown, followed by Daniel Johnson.
As an alumnus of the University of Stirling, the Minister will know that it's based in my constituency, that it has a reputation for both world-class research and teaching, and it's very attractive to international students. And I know the university has been working hard to ensure it's ready for the coming academic year and to once again welcome students from around the world. And I note what the Minister says about the increased numbers of applications from overseas, which is welcome. But can the Minister confirm what the Scottish Government is doing to support Stirling University and universities across Scotland to reassure international students that they represent a safe environment to undertake their studies in?
Minister.
I thank Keith Brown for his question and for mentioning the University of Stirling, which I've got a soft spot for the reasons he cited, as have others in the Chamber. I'd also like to take the opportunity of congratulating Jeremy McCormick, the Principal of the University of Stirling, who's now taken over as the Chair of University of Scotland. Therefore, my interaction with the University of Stirling is probably about to be heightened intensively over the coming weeks and months. But I can assure Keith Brown that the University of Stirling and all Scotland's universities are representing a leadership group that have been making their views extremely well known about the way forward for the whole sector and for Scotland, and I'm sure the University of Stirling will benefit from many of the measures we're implementing, just as they will across the board.
Thank you, Daniel Johnson, followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you. Applications from international students being up, there's no guarantee that those places will be taken up by those students, meaning that there's still some £700 million worth of fees at risk. So there's therefore growing concern that in the absence of additional Scottish Government financial support, higher education institutions will seek to claw back any shortfall in non-tuition-based fees and charges, such as accommodation. So can the Minister set out what steps he'll take to make sure that no such additional charges are imposed, with the consequent impact on student hardship that would have? Minister.
I thank Daniel Johnson for his question, and I expect all institutions in Scotland to be sensitive to the financial situation that prospective students and existing students face at the current time. I think, again, he paints a very inaccurate picture in that the Scottish Government, of course, allocated a one-off payment of £75 million for university research early on in this crisis, which was warmly welcomed by the sector, some of whose principals said to me, this is a lot more than the UK Government has done for the sector, and yet we've only got a population of 5.4 million people. But I accept there's more to be done, and I can assure Daniel Johnson we're having intense conversations with the UK Government, because many of the issues around this relate to the Treasury and other reserved issues, such as the main part of research funding, and we are seeking further help for the sectors. We are helping as much as we can within our powers. We do have a welcome package that has been in the UK Government so far, but we're waiting for the detail of that and working up how it will be delivered, and I hope that does deliver consequentials to Scotland so we can deliver the help that Daniel Johnson wants us to deliver.
Kenneth Gibson, followed by Mark Ruskell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Having called on the Scottish Government to cease paying the tuition fees of EU students, I welcome that decision, which I believe should be from this autumn. Can the Minister explain why new EU students starting courses this year will not have to pay tuition fees at all at any time in their course, and would resources thus committed not be better spent on Scottish students?
Minister.
Well, I could just say to Kenny Gibson that I hope he agrees that the presence of European students in Scotland's campuses has been very much valued over many, many years. And one of the strengths of Scotland's incredible reputation for education throughout the world is the internationalism of our campuses and the educational experience you get in this country, which benefits our students, and it's not just a case of others benefiting as well. And that's why we've always been a firm supporter of membership of the European Union and, of course, participating in Erasmus, Horizon 2020, and meeting our obligations to deliver home fee status for European students studying in this country. But we will stick to our commitment and contract we have with existing EU students who will receive the funding for the remainder of their courses. And, of course, last year we announced a transition year of this academic year to continue that whilst we awaited to see what was happening with Brexit.
Mark Ruskell, followed by Liz Smith.
Despite the financial crisis at Perth College, the Institute has continued to fill management posts during lockdown, a move which has concerned both lecturers and students about the pressure this now exerts to cut 21 teaching posts. Given the UHI is the only publicly funded higher or further education institute that lacks a collective bargaining agreement for all staff, does the Minister agree that it should develop one urgently in order to meet the government's Fair Work agenda?
Minister.
Well, as Mark Ruskell will know, our colleges and universities have got a responsibility to cut their cloth and make sure the books balance and run their institutions with the funds that are made available to them by the Scottish Funding Council and from other sources. And therefore, it's really a matter for Perth College and UHI, that's the matter that's highlighted by Mark Ruskell. I'd only say that at this sensitive time, given the pressures that people are facing in their personal lives and with their job security, given the impact of COVID-19, that all our institutions should, of course, be sensitive to the needs of their employees at this time, and I'm confident they're doing that, and I'll keep reiterating that message. And of course we have the Fair Work agenda as well, which I urge time and time again should always be respected by all our colleges and universities.
Liz Smith, followed by Beatrice Wishart.
Thank you. Can I ask the Minister if he agrees with University Scotland's analysis, which claims that there is now 127.6 million less invested each year into Scottish universities than there was in 2014-15. And that means that every Scottish student at university in this last year is almost 700 less in terms of the government funding. Is that not due to Scottish Government policy that these cuts have happened?
Minister.
Well, I should just say that if Liz Smith is quoting the figures from University of Scotland, she may also want to look down south and look at some of the financial situations facing the colleges and universities in England at the current time. We've had 10 years of austerity since the Conservative Party took office in 2010. And therefore, yes, we'd have loved to be in the position to allocate even more resources. We've managed to protect the resources very well for our colleges and universities and increase them from time to time. And we'd have loved to have the ability to allocate more resources. But the 10 years of austerity, of course, have not always made that possible. And now we're looking to the UK Government to make sure they can help us cope with the COVID-19, and they have a moral obligation also to help us cope with the £211 million cost of Brexit that Audit Scotland says is just round the corner as we head towards a hard Brexit.
Beatrice Wishart, followed by Bob Doris.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. University Scotland say that digital poverty will reinforce disadvantage. We know about the delays in delivering the R100 programme in the Highlands and Islands. It's well behind schedule. So if online learning is to be a feature of higher and further education, what can be done for those students in rural, remote and island areas with internet speeds that can't cope with online lectures and learning?
Minister.
Thank Beatrice Wishart for her question. It's a very important point. It features throughout all our conversations with the sectors throughout COVID-19 as we've had to have this remarkable shift to online learning. Many institutions, particularly UHI actually, were already there, but others had to shift quite quickly. And that is why we are very conscious that there are many people out there due for financial reasons or other reasons, rurality, that are unable to have the same connectivity as their peers. And that's why we did announce today in my statement £5 million to help address these kinds of issues for further and higher education. And that will be targeted towards vulnerable families and some of the people that Beatrice Wishart mentioned in her question. I've also instigated conversations with some of the telecommunication providers to see what we can do to get their support to help provide free access online for learners in Scotland.
Thank you, Bob Doris, followed by Sarah Boyack.
Presiding Officer, following the impact of COVID-19, I know Glasgow, Kelvin College and others are up for the challenge of adapting apprenticeship provision to be flexible and responsive, including the possibility of pathway apprenticeships. Can the Scottish Government say more about this vital and ongoing role of colleges in this particular area, and what assurances can the changing landscape of apprenticeships can you give that this won't impact on the income of FE colleges who rely on income from both foundation and modern apprenticeships at this time?
Minister.
Well, as Bob Doris will know, as we move forward towards economic recovery, the Benny Higgins report and other reports have said that our colleges in particular, right across, obviously have further and higher education as well, but our colleges in particular are going to have a big role in reskilling and upskilling and developing short, sharp courses to help retrain the workforce who may be looking for different employment opportunities and to help businesses cope with the post-COVID-19 economy. So our colleges will be at the heart of that, and the Skills Minister, Jamie Hepburn, is taking forward a lot of that work directly with the colleges as we speak.
Sarah Boyack, to be followed by Maureen Watt. Thank you, Presiding Officer. Cabinet Secretary, how many fully funded places for Scottish students will be delivered from the £19 million predicted to come from EU student fees next year? And can the Cabinet Secretary outline the role of universities in the Job Guarantee Scheme?
Minister.
In terms of the Job Guarantee Scheme, we again know that the colleges and universities are likely to play a role in that, but it's very early days because we've just had these announcements very, very recently. But we are turning our minds with the college and universities to economic recovery and the role they can play, as I just remarked in my previous answer to Bob Doris. And in terms of the number of Scottish places that would be funded by the £19 million that will be available as a result of not funding EU places, university funding places is quite complex. You can't quickly work out because it depends on how many applications there are, how many places the universities decide to create with the money that's allocated to them from the Scottish Government. So we allocate the money, they can decide how to use that across courses and across places. Clearly, as I've said in my opening statement, there will now be £19 million in the system available for Scottish places, and the universities are expected to take that up that offer and hopefully lead to more Scots going to university.
And Maureen Watt, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Given that a strong and flourishing higher and further education sector is not only vital for those studying at these institutions, but vital to our wider economic recovery from this pandemic, the Cabinet Secretary will be aware of the Institute of Fiscal Studies report, which finds that 13 universities across the UK may be at risk of insolvency, particularly due to the loss of international students. And can he say what risk assessments and contingency planning are being taken in Scottish universities to cope with these pressures?
Minister.
I thank Maureen Watt for her question. And firstly, I can assure the Parliament that the Scottish Funding Council are working closely with all our colleges and universities at the current time to ensure they survive and get through this. But of course, they'll be carrying out the review that they've been asked to carry out in terms of the future financing of the sector and its sustainability, and we'll wait and see what comes out of that particular debate. Of course, the analysis so far from the Scottish Funding Council has said that the Scottish universities for this academic year face a potential loss of £72 million and between £384 million and £651 million thereafter if there is a decline in international students, as some people are potentially predicting. We have to wait and see what happens, but we're going to stand by our universities going forward and indeed our colleges as well.
Thank you. That concludes questions on the statement, which brings us to decision time. And as there are no questions, we put as a result of today's business. That concludes decision time. And I close this meeting. But I don't want you to leave, please, because we're going to test the mobile phone voting system. And so if you just wait till the presiding officer comes, as he's going to rally you with that.
How do you mean no more commission?
Well, no one in Scotland can commission an idea. You know, if I went to BBC Scotland and I said, oh, I've got this great idea for a sitcom, I've got this brilliant idea for a drama, you know, there isn't one person in Scotland that can okay it unless it goes through London.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of Full Scottish. What's happening today?
Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
That need, that desire for independence is ever stronger than perhaps it was in 2014. So there's an obligation that we've got to give leadership to that campaign. That's what Nicola Sturgeon, as our First Minister, has been doing.
My feeling about Boris Johnson is he can't be trusted on anything.
That is now and forever will be known as the rape clause.
I'm old enough to remember going into Europe in '73, and I remember how much of a razor's edge that was balanced on. And I think we made it by 53%, if I remember correctly, for going in. And ever since that time, England particularly has been pretty much schizophrenic, down the middle about whether it felt British or whether it felt European. And that schism, that crack has remained throughout English society ever since.
Scotland means business. Scotland's voice won't be stilled, it won't be silenced, it has to be heard.
About the work that's been done by Broadcasting Scotland in giving community activists, yes activists, Scottish activists a platform other than the traditional media outlets.